The weight of honest words. Daniel Mercer built his career believing truth should always come first, regardless of consequences. Every investigation exposes corruption, lies, abuse of power, and hypocrisy. His articles have imprisoned politicians, ruined CEOs, destroyed criminal organizations, and even exposed beloved public figures. To Daniel, truth is sacred. To everyone around him, he is fearless. Until he meets Evelyn Rhodes. She is quietly protecting a secret that, if revealed, would shatter countless lives, including those of people who have done nothing wrong. For the first time in his career, Daniel must ask himself whether every truth deserves to be spoken. The weight of honest words' rain tapped steadily against the tall windows of the newsroom, turning the city beyond them into a blur of gray buildings and glowing headlights. Phones rang somewhere across the floor. Keyboards clicked without pause. Television screens mounted on distant walls rolled through the day's headlines, each one trying to be louder than the last. Daniel Mercer barely noticed any of it. His notebook rested beside a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. Every page inside was covered with neat handwriting. Dates, times, names, bank transfers, phone records, small observations collected over 6 months. Nothing in the notebook had been written without proof. Margaret Ellis walked toward his desk carrying a folder under one arm. She stopped beside him. "You've read it again?" Daniel nodded without looking up. 3 times, and every document supports the others. Margaret folded her arms. Every source, confirmed independently. Every accusation, supported. Any room for doubt? Daniel finally lifted his eyes, not enough to stop publication. Margaret remained silent for several seconds. She had known Daniel for almost 15 years, long enough to recognize the difference between confidence and arrogance. Today, she saw only certainty. She set the folder on his desk. "Councilman Richard Hale has called 6 times. Daniel returned his attention to the notebook. "He'll call again. Probably." Margaret watched him. "He says you're destroying an innocent man's life." Daniel closed the notebook. "If he's innocent, the documents are false. If the documents are false, he'll prove it." "He hasn't," Margaret sighed. "He has 2 children." Daniel answered quietly. "Then he should have thought about them before taking money from developers." She studied him. "You always make it sound simple. Facts usually are. People aren't." Daniel did not answer. Margaret picked up the folder again. "Publication goes live in 40 minutes. She walked away. Daniel leaned back in his chair. The newsroom continued moving around him like a machine that never stopped. Reporters hurried between desks carrying printouts. Editors argued over headlines. Someone laughed near the elevators before immediately returning to work. Daniel opened another page in his notebook. A photograph had been taped beside several handwritten notes. Richard Hale smiled into the camera while shaking hands with local residents during a neighborhood event. Behind the smile sat $12 million in hidden payments. Daniel remembered the first anonymous tip. One sentence: "Look at the housing contracts." Most anonymous messages led nowhere. This one had become 6 months of interviews, public records, financial audits, and late nights inside courthouse archives. Every answer created another question. Every question uncovered another lie, until the whole structure collapsed under its own weight. Lucas Bennett hurried across the newsroom carrying a tablet. His hair was damp from the rain outside. "Daniel." Daniel looked up. Lucas smiled with the excitement of someone still new enough to believe every investigation could change the world. Legal approved everything. Daniel accepted the tablet. The article filled the screen. Every paragraph had been polished until nothing unnecessary remained. No dramatic language, no speculation, only evidence. Lucas watched him. "This is incredible." Daniel continued reading. "We'll see. You're exposing one of the most powerful people in city government. If evidence is accurate, position doesn't matter. Lucas laughed softly. You always say things like that because they are true. Lucas leaned against the desk. Do you ever get nervous? Daniel looked at him. About publishing, about ruining someone's career. Daniel thought for a moment. I'm not ruining it. He did. Lucas nodded immediately. Exactly. Daniel noticed the certainty in the younger man's voice. It reminded him of himself years earlier. Margaret appeared again from the conference room. 10 minutes, editors are ready. Daniel stood. The conference room overlooked the rainy streets below. 8 people gathered around the table. Lawyers, senior editors, department heads. No one spoke until Daniel sat down. Margaret looked around the room. Last chance. Anyone believes we shouldn't publish? Silence. The newspaper's attorney adjusted his glasses. Evidence exceeds our normal standards. Financial editor? Solid. Managing editor? No concerns. Margaret turned toward Daniel. Anything you want to add? Daniel looked at the printed copies spread across the table. Only this. Truth doesn't become less true because someone powerful dislikes it. Several heads nodded. Margaret remained expressionless. Meeting adjourned. Publication in 5 minutes. The room emptied. Only Margaret and Daniel remained. She closed the door. Sit down. Daniel obeyed. Margaret remained standing beside the window. You know why I keep asking the same questions every investigation? Because you're thorough. She smiled faintly. No, because every story has consequences beyond facts. Daniel waited. She continued. You've exposed corrupt judges, violent gangs, fraud, human trafficking. Every one of those stories deserved daylight. She looked out across the city, but every investigation leaves people behind. Spouses, children, parents, employees, neighbors, people who never chose any of it. Daniel answered carefully, that doesn't make publication wrong. No, it doesn't. She faced him again, but remembering them keeps us human. Daniel held her gaze. If we stop reporting because innocent people might get hurt, we become accomplices. Margaret nodded slowly. True. She walked toward the door. Just promise me something. What? Never become so committed to truth that you stop seeing people. She left before he could answer. Daniel remained alone. He wasn't offended. Margaret always challenged him before important publications. It had become a tradition neither of them mentioned. 5 minutes later, the article went live. Across the newsroom, phones began ringing almost immediately. One editor raised a hand, traffic's exploding. Another called across the room. Television stations already picked it up. Someone else shouted. The mayor's office released a statement. Lucas hurried toward Daniel again. It's everywhere. Daniel watched the article appear on monitors around the office. His byline sat beneath the headline. Councilman Richard Hale accepted millions in hidden development payments. No excitement rose inside him, only relief. Months of uncertainty had ended. Facts no longer belonged only to him, now they belonged to everyone. His office phone rang. Reception transferred the call before he could refuse it. Daniel Mercer. A man's breathing filled the line. Then came a controlled voice. You've made a terrible mistake. Richard Hale. Daniel recognized him immediately. If there's an error, there isn't. You think you know everything. I know what's supported by evidence. You're proud of this? Daniel looked across the newsroom. Reporters were already writing follow-up articles. If the evidence is wrong, I'll correct it publicly. If it's right, you don't understand what you've done. Daniel remained calm. Help me understand. Silence. Then Hale spoke more quietly. My daughter has school tomorrow. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. I'm sorry for her. That doesn't change the story. The line went dead. Daniel slowly lowered the receiver. Lucas approached again. Was that him? Daniel nodded. How'd he take it? About as expected. Lucas shook his head. People always blame reporters. Daniel said nothing. Outside, rain continued falling across the city. By evening, every major news station carried the investigation. Commentators debated ethics. Politicians denied involvement. Developers canceled interviews. Financial investigators announced formal inquiries. Social media exploded with outrage. Daniel ignored all of it. He packed his notebook into his worn leather satchel, pulled on his coat, left through the front doors of the newspaper building. Cold air met him immediately. Downtown streets reflected red brake lights across wet pavement. People hurried beneath umbrellas without looking at one another. Daniel walked several blocks before stopping at a small neighborhood cafe. The owner greeted him with a familiar nod. "Usual, please." He chose the same table near the window. The coffee arrived a minute later. He opened his notebook again, not to admire finished work, to prepare for whatever came next. That was his habit. Every ending became another beginning. His phone vibrated. Margaret. She rarely called after work. Daniel answered, "Everything all right? Depends how you define all right. What's happened?" She sounded unusually serious. "Reception received something after you left. An envelope, no return address." Daniel listened. Inside, photographs, copies of old records, no explanation. "About Hale? No. Then what?" Margaret paused. "I think you should come back tomorrow morning before anyone else sees it." "Why?" "Because if these documents are genuine..." She stopped herself. Daniel waited. Margaret finally finished. "You may have just found the biggest story of your career." He looked through the rain-streaked window at the city beyond. For the first time that day, he felt something unfamiliar. Not certainty, curiosity. Daniel arrived at the newspaper building before sunrise. The streets were still wet from the night's rain. Delivery trucks rumbled through empty intersections, and the city's usual noise had not yet awakened. The old brick building stood quietly beneath the gray morning sky, its windows glowing with only a handful of lights. He unlocked the newsroom door with his employee badge. The room felt strangely peaceful without ringing phones and hurried conversations. Margaret was already there. She sat alone in the conference room, a cup of tea beside her and a thick manila envelope resting on the table. She looked up as Daniel entered. "You came early. You sounded concerned." "I was." Daniel removed his coat and sat across from her. Neither of them reached for the envelope immediately. Margaret spoke first. "I didn't sleep much." "Neither did I." She slid the package toward him. No fingerprints worth identifying. No postage. "Someone walked in yesterday afternoon and handed it to reception. They refused to leave a name. They said only one sentence. 'Give this to Daniel Mercer.' Then they disappeared before security could stop them." Daniel examined the envelope. Plain brown paper. No markings. No handwriting except his own name typed onto a white label. He carefully opened the flap. Inside were dozens of photocopies, several old newspaper articles, court records, insurance documents, property maps, a handful of photographs. Everything looked organized, not random. Someone wanted him to follow a trail. He picked up the first newspaper clipping. Apartment fire claims 7 lives. 20 years earlier, he turned another page. Investigation concludes electrical failure likely cause. Then another. Maintenance worker accepts responsibility. Daniel frowned. He reached for the photographs. One showed a burned apartment building. Only its brick shell remained standing. Firefighters stood outside beneath clouds of smoke. Another showed a courtroom. A tired-looking man walked beside 2 police officers. The caption underneath identified him as Michael Turner, building maintenance supervisor. Daniel continued reading. Turner had admitted negligence during maintenance inspections. Sentenced to prison. Released years later, now deceased. Margaret watched him quietly. Anything familiar? No. Daniel turned another page. A handwritten note had been clipped to the documents. Only one sentence. The wrong man paid, no signature. Daniel looked up. "Someone wants me to reopen this. Looks that way." He spread the documents across the table. Dates, addresses, names, insurance claims, witness lists. Every page had sections highlighted, not randomly, very deliberately. He noticed one name appearing again: Thomas Rhodes, architect, mentioned only briefly. Consultant during redevelopment discussions several years after the fire. Nothing unusual. He searched further. Another mention. Thomas Rhodes Foundation donated $3 million to affordable housing. Another. Rhodes Design Group renovated community center. Another. Interview praising his charitable work. Daniel leaned back. This doesn't fit. Margaret nodded. That's exactly what bothered me. He's barely connected. Yet someone highlighted every appearance. Daniel looked again at the anonymous note. The wrong man paid. His eyes moved back to Michael Turner's conviction. If Turner wasn't responsible, who was? Lucas hurried into the newsroom carrying 2 coffees. He stopped when he saw papers covering the conference table. Morning, morning, he noticed Daniel's expression. What's happened? Margaret answered, new investigation. Lucas smiled. Already? Daniel handed him one newspaper clipping. Lucas read quietly. Apartment fire, 20 years ago, looks ordinary. That's what worries me. Lucas examined another page. Maintenance worker confessed. Case closed. Daniel shook his head. Confessions don't automatically make cases correct. Lucas looked surprised. You think someone else started it? I don't know. Then why investigate? Daniel pointed to the anonymous note. Because someone went to considerable effort to send this. People rarely spend this much time creating elaborate lies. Margaret added calmly. And if it is a lie, Daniel will discover that too. Lucas nodded. Fair enough. Daniel organized the papers into small stacks. Chronology first, photographs second, legal records, media coverage. He worked silently for nearly half an hour. His notebook slowly filled with names connected by arrows. Fire, insurance company, city inspectors, witnesses, property owners, fire department, maintenance staff, then one separate circle. Thomas Rhodes, ? Lucas leaned over his shoulder. Why isolate him? Daniel tapped the highlighted newspaper articles. Someone wants me looking at him, which means either he's guilty or someone wants him to appear guilty. Margaret smiled faintly. Now you're asking the right questions. Daniel closed his notebook. I need background. Lucas already had his tablet open. Thomas Rhodes, age 56, founder of Rhodes Urban Design, National Architecture Awards, designed hospitals, schools, affordable housing projects, frequently donates to charities, no criminal record, no scandals, married, widower, children, none. Daniel listened without interrupting. Lucas continued scrolling. Public approval ratings are unusually high. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Public approval ratings? Journalists track everything. Lucas shrugged. People love him. His interviews are everywhere. Community projects, historic preservation, affordable housing. He practically has a saint's reputation. Margaret folded her arms, which means 2 possibilities. Daniel finished her sentence. Either someone wants to destroy a good man, or a good man has hidden something extraordinary. The room became quiet. Rain began tapping softly against the conference room windows. Daniel gathered every document back into the envelope. First step, visit the courthouse, review original case files. Second, fire department archives. Third, interview surviving investigators if any are still alive. Lucas looked eager. Need help? Daniel considered it. You'll handle media coverage. Collect every article ever written about the fire, especially local papers. No summaries, original reporting only. Lucas grinned. Got it. He hurried away. Margaret remained seated. One more thing. Daniel stopped. Why do you think this came now? He looked at the envelope again. Because whoever sent it believes something has changed. Such as, I don't know yet, but anonymous sources usually have timing. People keep secrets for years. Then suddenly they don't. Margaret nodded. Good. Keep asking why now, not only what happened. Daniel slipped the envelope into his satchel. As he reached the newsroom doors, his phone buzzed. Unknown number, he answered, Daniel Mercer. For several seconds, no one spoke, only faint breathing, then a woman's calm voice. Please don't investigate Thomas Rhodes. The line went dead. Daniel slowly lowered the phone. No explanation, no threat, no anger, only a quiet request. For the first time since opening the anonymous envelope, the investigation no longer felt like history. Someone was still afraid of what he might find. Daniel spent the rest of the morning inside the county courthouse archives. The basement smelled of old paper and dust. Metal shelves stretched across the room, each lined with gray storage boxes labeled by year. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, giving everything a washed-out color. An elderly archivist adjusted her glasses as Daniel approached the counter. Can I help you? I'm looking for records related to the Westbrook Apartments fire. 20 years ago. She nodded. I remember that one. You do? Hard to forget. Biggest residential fire I'd seen while working here. She disappeared into the rows of shelves. Daniel opened his notebook while he waited. When she returned, she pushed 3 heavy archive boxes across the counter. Everything that became public is in here. Public? She hesitated. Some evidence was sealed during the criminal proceedings. Why? I couldn't tell you. Daniel thanked her and carried the boxes to a reading table. The first contained police reports. The second held court transcripts. The third contained photographs. He began with the witness statements. Most were painfully ordinary. People smelled smoke. Someone heard shouting. Another remembered lights flickering before the fire. No statement clearly identified how the blaze started. He turned another page. Interview with Michael Turner, building maintenance supervisor. The transcript showed a tired man answering questions with almost mechanical certainty. Yes, no, I should have inspected the wiring. It was my responsibility. I failed. Daniel read the interview twice. Something felt wrong, not what Turner said, how he said it. Every answer accepted blame. None explained what had actually happened. He flipped ahead. No follow-up questions, no challenge, no request for clarification. He underlined a sentence. I failed, nothing more. His pen stopped. People who confessed usually explained, they defended themselves, made excuses, shifted blame. Turner did none of those things. He simply accepted guilt. Daniel wrote in his notebook, confession unusually passive, need original interrogation. He continued, insurance records, electrical inspections, engineering assessments. Most agreed the official cause could not be determined with certainty because so much evidence had been destroyed. He frowned, yet someone had still gone to prison. By noon, he had filled several pages. The evidence did not prove Turner was innocent, but it no longer convinced him he was guilty. His phone buzzed. Lucas, find anything? Daniel closed one folder. More questions than answers. Same here. Lucas sounded frustrated. Every newspaper article after the trial repeats exactly the same story. Turner accepted responsibility. Case closed. Nothing about Thomas, almost nothing. He donated to rebuild a community center nearby 10 years later. That's it. Daniel thanked him and ended the call. He stared at the old courtroom photograph again. Michael Turner looked exhausted, not defeated, not angry, just tired. Daniel packed the files and signed them back into the archive. Outside, the rain had returned. He walked several blocks beneath his umbrella before stopping outside the city fire department headquarters. The receptionist directed him downstairs. Captain Harold Simmons had retired 5 years earlier, still consulted occasionally. Fortunately, he happened to be visiting. The retired captain welcomed Daniel into a small office. His white hair contrasted sharply against his navy jacket. You're Mercer. Daniel nodded. You've made some enemies over the years. Occupational hazard. Simmons smiled. Fair enough. What can I do for you? I'm reviewing the Westbrook Apartments fire. The The smile faded. That's old history. History sometimes deserves another look. Simmons leaned back. Not that one. Why? Because there wasn't much left to learn. Daniel opened his notebook. Do you believe Michael Turner caused it? The old captain remained silent. Finally, he answered. I believe the court reached its decision. That's not what I asked. No, it isn't. Daniel waited. Simmons looked toward the rain outside the window. Fire destroys evidence. People hate uncertainty. Courts don't. They need answers. Did you ever find one? The captain rubbed his jaw. Not when I was comfortable signing my name to. Daniel's pen stopped moving. Then why didn't you object? I did. Officially, nothing changed. Daniel studied the older man's face. You think Turner confessed to something he didn't do? I didn't say that. You almost did. Simmons stood. Interview's over. Daniel recognized the moment. Pressing harder would accomplish nothing. He thanked the captain and left. Outside, rainwater streamed along the sidewalks. His notebook now held something more valuable than evidence. Doubt. By late afternoon, he arrived at Rhodes Urban Design. The office occupied the renovated upper floors of an old warehouse overlooking the river. Large windows filled the building with soft, natural light despite the cloudy sky. Plants stood beside polished wooden furniture. Architectural models lined shelves across the reception area. Nothing felt extravagant. Everything felt carefully designed. The receptionist smiled warmly. May I help you? I'd like to speak with Thomas Rhodes. Do you have an appointment? No, I'm Daniel Mercer. Recognition appeared immediately. One moment. She disappeared through a hallway. Several employees quietly glanced toward him. Some whispered. His reputation often arrived before he did. The receptionist returned. I'm sorry. Mr. Rhodes is unavailable today. Could I schedule another time? Certainly. She reached for a calendar. Before she could speak again, another voice answered gently. He's at the hospice. Daniel turned. A woman stood near the hallway entrance, mid-30s, brown hair pulled loosely behind her shoulders. Simple navy coat, tired eyes, calm expression. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to comforting strangers. The receptionist looked surprised. MS. Rhodes, it's all right. She stepped forward. I'm Evelyn. Thomas is my brother. Daniel nodded politely. Daniel Mercer. I know, she offered a small, restrained smile. Your articles have helped many people. That wasn't the response he expected. Thank you. She glanced briefly toward the reception desk. Would you mind walking with me? Daniel agreed. They stepped outside beneath the gray afternoon sky. Rain had weakened into a light mist. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. You're investigating my brother. Daniel chose honesty. Yes. May I ask why? Not yet, because you don't know, because I don't have enough evidence. She nodded slowly. That answer seemed to relieve her slightly. They continued walking beside the river. The water reflected steel-colored clouds overhead. Daniel studied her carefully. She appeared composed. But her hands remained tightly clasped together inside her coat pockets, a small sign of nervousness. Do you believe Thomas has committed a crime? Daniel answered carefully. I don't know, then why investigate him? Someone wants me to. She looked down. Anonymous source? Yes. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, almost as if she had expected that answer. When she opened them again, her voice remained calm. My brother has spent his entire life trying to help people. People often have more than one life. She accepted that without arguing. Then she asked quietly if you discover something painful. Will you publish it? Daniel answered without hesitation. If it's true. She stopped walking. Rain collected on the shoulders of her coat. Please don't. Daniel looked at her. She did not appear angry or defensive. She looked afraid, not for herself, for someone else. I can't promise that. I know, her voice remained gentle. I'm asking anyway. Daniel searched her expression. Most people he investigated denied everything. Threatened lawsuits. demanded meetings, insisted they were innocent. Evelyn did none of those things. She simply looked exhausted. "May I ask one question, of course? Is your brother dangerous?" She answered immediately. "No, has he ever hurt you?" "Never. Has he ever asked you to lie for him?" A flicker crossed her face. "Barely noticeable." Then she replied, "No." Daniel noticed the hesitation, only half a second, enough to remember, enough to write down later. She looked toward the river again. There are truths that don't make the world better. Daniel responded almost automatically. "If they are true, people deserve them." "Do they?" She turned toward him. "Even if innocent lives break because of them?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Margaret's words returned to him. "Remember the people behind the headlines." He pushed the thought aside. If innocent people suffer because someone committed a crime, the responsibility belongs to the person who committed it, not to the journalist. Evelyn listened quietly. Perhaps. Then she smiled sadly. "I hope you're right." A phone vibrated inside her pocket. She glanced at the screen. "I have to go." "My patients are waiting." "Patients? I'm a hospice nurse." Daniel nodded. That explained the exhaustion. "The patients." The calm voice. She took a few steps away before stopping. "Mr. Mercer, yes, whatever you're looking for. Please understand all of it before deciding what it means." She walked toward a nearby parking lot without looking back. Daniel remained beside the river. He opened his notebook. Instead of writing immediately, he watched her leave. When she disappeared around the corner, he finally wrote, "Evelyn Rhodes, hospice nurse. Protective, fear genuine, not protecting herself, protecting someone else. Possible deception during questioning. Find hospice. Find Thomas. Determine reason for warning." As he closed the notebook, another realization settled into his mind. The anonymous caller from yesterday had spoken with the same calm, gentle voice. He could not prove it, but he was suddenly almost certain he had already spoken to Evelyn once before. Daniel arrived at the hospice just after 8 the next morning. The rain had finally stopped. Moisture still clung to the trees lining the entrance, and the flower beds glistened beneath the pale autumn light. Unlike the courthouse or the newspaper office, the building was quiet. Conversations never rose above a gentle murmur. A receptionist smiled as he entered. "Good morning." "Good morning. I'm looking for Thomas Rhodes. Do you have an appointment?" "No." She checked her computer. "I'm sorry. Mr. Rhodes left about 20 minutes ago." Daniel nodded. "Does he come here often?" "Every week." The receptionist immediately caught herself. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't discuss our visitors. That's all right." As he turned to leave, another voice spoke from the hallway. "Mr. Mercer." Daniel recognized it before he turned around. Evelyn approached wearing pale blue scrubs beneath a dark sweater. The exhaustion he had noticed yesterday remained in her eyes, though she greeted him politely. "I thought you might come. I hope to speak with your brother. He's already gone." Daniel glanced toward the hallway. "Does he volunteer here?" Evelyn considered the question. Sometimes he visits people who don't have family." Daniel wrote nothing. He simply remembered the answer. Evelyn noticed. "You memorize conversations. Usually, that must be exhausting." Daniel almost smiled. "Sometimes." She motioned toward a side door. "Would you like some coffee?" He hesitated. "I'm not trying to stop your investigation." She answered the unspoken concern. "I'm only offering coffee." Daniel accepted. The hospice cafe was little more than a small room with 6 tables overlooking a modest garden. The flowers had begun to fade with the season. Several elderly patients sat quietly with visitors. Nobody seemed in a hurry. Evelyn returned carrying 2 paper cups. She sat across from him. Neither spoke for a while. Daniel looked through the window. People here measure time differently. Evelyn followed his gaze. They have to. Daniel turned back toward her. "You said Thomas sometimes visits people without families." "Yes." "Why?" "Because nobody should die alone." Daniel waited. She offered nothing more. He changed direction. "How long have you worked here?" 11 years. Do you enjoy it? Some days. Other days I simply try to help. You must see death often. Every day. Daniel noticed she answered difficult questions without hesitation. Only questions about Thomas made her careful. Yesterday, you asked whether every truth deserves to be told. Yes. Why? She wrapped both hands around her coffee. Because I spend my life with people who know they are running out of time. Daniel listened. Some tell their families everything. Some tell them almost nothing. Some carry secrets until their final breath. She looked into the garden. I've learned there isn't one correct way to leave the world. Daniel answered quietly. Secrets don't disappear because someone dies. No, they become someone else's burden. The sentence lingered between them. Daniel changed the subject again. When did your parents die? Her eyes returned to him. Our mother when I was 23. Our father 6 years later. You're close with your brother. Very, you trust him completely. Even knowing whatever this anonymous person wants me to find? She nodded. Yes, Daniel watched her carefully. Not blind loyalty. Certainty. That interested him more. Their conversation ended when a nurse entered the cafe. Evelyn, room 12 needs you. I'll be there, she stood. Thank you for the coffee. Daniel rose as well. Thank you for accepting it. She paused before leaving. Mr. Mercer, yes, if you ever meet someone who's spent 20 years regretting one decision, remember that regret changes people. She disappeared down the hallway. Daniel remained standing. 20 years. The same amount of time since the fire. He wrote the number in his notebook, then circled it. Outside, he called Lucas. I need everything you can find on the victims, already working on it. Anything unusual? Lucas hesitated. Actually, go ahead. One victim's family moved away almost immediately after the trial. Another accepted private financial assistance years later. Anonymous donor. Daniel stopped walking. Anonymous, couldn't trace it. Legal charity. Perfectly clean. Started about 3 years after the fire. Still active today. Daniel's pulse quickened. How many families? 5. Amount? Enough to pay college tuition, medical bills, housing support. Lucas sounded puzzled. Whoever funds it has spent millions. Daniel looked across the street without really seeing it. Don't tell anyone else. Already figured you wouldn't want me to. I'll send everything. 20 minutes later, Daniel sat inside the public library reading scanned financial reports. The charitable foundation had no obvious connection to Thomas Rhodes. No board membership. No public donations under his name. Everything ended in another foundation. Then another. Then another. The trail vanished, almost professionally. He wrote one sentence. Someone worked very hard to stay invisible. His phone vibrated. Margaret, tell me you've eaten today. Not yet. Go eat. I'm busy. So was I at your age. Go eat anyway. Daniel looked around the nearly empty library. Fine, there's something else. Margaret continued. I asked legal about the sealed evidence. And, court order, only reopened under extraordinary circumstances. Can we request access? Yes. Will we receive it? Probably not. Daniel thanked her. One more closed door. By late afternoon, he visited the neighborhood where Westbrook Apartments had once stood. The original building was gone. A small park occupied the property now. Children played near swings while parents watched from nearby benches. Nothing suggested that 7 people had died there. Near the entrance stood a modest stone plaque, dedicated to those lost in the Westbrook fire. May this place always remember them. Daniel walked slowly through the park. Halfway across, he noticed an elderly groundskeeper trimming shrubs. Excuse me. The man looked up. Yes, were you here 20 years ago? The old man nodded. Lived across the street. Daniel introduced himself. The groundskeeper's expression changed immediately. You're the reporter. I am, still digging into old ghosts? Sometimes. The old man rested both hands on the handle of his rake. People around here stopped talking about that fire years ago. Why? Because everyone got tired. Tired? Grieving is exhausting. especially when nobody knows what would make it end. Daniel looked toward the plaque. Do people still visit? Every year, families, old neighbors, sometimes strangers. Sometimes. He stopped. Sometimes what? The old man pointed toward a weathered oak tree near the center of the park. There's a man comes every October, always alone, leaves flowers, sits there for about an hour, never speaks, then leaves. Daniel already knew the answer before asking. Thomas Rhodes, the groundskeeper, looked surprised. You know him, only his name. Kind fellow, never causes trouble, looks sad, always has. Daniel felt something shift. Anonymous charity, hospice visits, flowers every year. None of it matched the image of a powerful man hiding corruption, yet none of it explained the anonymous envelope either. His phone buzzed again. Lucas, I found something else. What? Old property ownership records. Thomas Rhodes lived in Westbrook Apartments. Daniel froze. Before the fire. Yes. Apartment 4C. He moved out. Lucas paused while checking another document. 3 days before the fire. Daniel stared silently at the memorial plaque. 3 days. Not 3 years, not 3 months. 3 days. Everything he believed he understood about the case suddenly rearranged itself. Instead of answering one question, the evidence had just created 10 more. Daniel lowered the phone slowly. 3 days. He repeated the number quietly to himself, not because he doubted Lucas, because his mind refused to accept how neatly it fit beside everything else. The park suddenly felt different. Children laughed near the swings. A dog chased a ball across the wet grass. 2 elderly women talked beneath umbrellas. Life had continued. The fire had become a memory, but someone had carried it every day for 20 years. Daniel looked toward the old groundskeeper. You're certain that man comes here every year? The old man nodded. Never misses. Always near the anniversary. Always the same flowers. What kind? White lilies. Does he ever speak to anyone? No, he just sits there, looks at nothing, or maybe something only he can see. Daniel thanked him and walked toward the oak tree. The ground beneath it was damp with fallen leaves. He crouched beside the trunk. There were no fresh flowers, only old stems long since removed, no messages, no names, nothing. Yet the place felt deliberate, as though someone had chosen it years ago and never stopped returning. He opened his notebook. Westbrook Apartments. Thomas lived there, moved out 3 days before fire, returns every anniversary, visits hospice regularly, anonymous charitable support to victims, no public connection. Question: witness, survivor, responsible. The final word lingered beneath his pen. He didn't underline it. He wasn't ready. His phone vibrated again. Lucas. Sorry to bother you again. Go ahead, I checked the lease records twice. There's no mistake. Thomas definitely lived there. Anything else? Actually, Lucas sounded uncertain. There was another tenant in the same building. Apartment 2B, name, Evelyn Rhodes. Daniel stood still. She lived there too for about a year. Then both addresses disappear after the fire. Daniel looked around the quiet park. Did she move out with him? Looks that way. Any record they own the building? Nothing. Just tenants. Daniel thanked him and ended the call. Now Evelyn's fear made even less sense. If both siblings had escaped before the fire, why were they still haunted by it? He crossed the street toward a small diner overlooking the park. Inside, only a handful of customers occupied the booths. He ordered coffee and spread copies of his notes across the table. He drew a timeline. 3 days before fire. Thomas moves out. Evelyn moves out. Fire. 7 dead. Michael Turner confesses. Case closed. Years later, anonymous donations begin. Thomas builds reputation. 20 years pass. Anonymous package arrives. 1 sentence. The wrong man paid. Daniel stared at the page. Every fact was verified. Together they made no sense. He circled the timeline. Something was missing, not one detail. 1 event. The waitress refilled his coffee. Long day? Daniel nodded, trying to solve something. Hope you figure it out. "So do I." She smiled politely and walked away. Daniel returned to the notes. If Thomas had started the fire intentionally, why spend 20 years quietly helping the victims if he had started it accidentally? Why hadn't anyone discovered it if he had nothing to do with it? Why move away 3 days before it happened? Coincidence? He hated that word. Coincidences existed, but good investigations never relied on them. As evening settled over the city, Daniel returned to the newsroom. Lucas was still at his desk. I found another photograph. He slid a scanned image across the table. It showed residents gathered outside Westbrook Apartments during a neighborhood barbecue several weeks before the fire. Families smiled toward the camera. Children sat on bicycles. Neighbors held paper plates. Daniel examined every face. There, Thomas, much younger, laughing with several neighbors. Beside him stood a young woman, Evelyn, almost unrecognizable without the years of quiet exhaustion. She was smiling. Between them stood a little girl, perhaps 8 years old, holding both of their hands. Daniel frowned. "Who's the child?" Lucas checked the back of the scanned photograph. No identification, just the date. Daniel looked closer. Everyone in the picture seemed comfortable around Thomas. No one avoided him. No one feared him if he had secretly been dangerous. He hid it extraordinarily well. Or Daniel looked again at the child. He wasn't dangerous at all. Lucas leaned forward. "What are you thinking?" Daniel answered honestly. "I'm thinking every answer creates a contradiction." He tapped the photograph. "People don't usually smile like this around monsters." Lucas hesitated. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe. Daniel wasn't convinced. He placed the photograph beside the timeline. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, just not the one he had expected. His office phone rang. Neither man recognized the number. Daniel answered. Daniel Mercer. Several seconds passed. Then the same calm female voice spoke. "You found out they lived there." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Who is this, please?" Her breathing trembled for the first time. "Stop before you hurt people who have already suffered enough. Were you the one who sent the envelope?" Silence. "Did Thomas start the fire?" Another silence. Then she spoke so quietly he almost missed it. "You're asking the wrong question." The line disconnected. Daniel continued holding the receiver. Lucas watched him. "Same woman?" Daniel nodded. "What did she say?" He looked at the timeline, then at the photograph, then at the words written in his notebook. "The wrong man paid." Slowly, he drew a line through one question. "Did Thomas start the fire?" Beside it, he wrote another. "Why does everyone seem more afraid of the truth than of the crime itself?" For the first time since opening the anonymous envelope, Daniel realized he might not be investigating a criminal. He might be investigating a confession that nobody wanted to hear. Daniel spent most of the next morning standing across the street from Rhodes Urban Design. He had learned long ago that interviews often began before anyone spoke. Employees arrived carrying coffee and blueprints. They greeted one another by name. Delivery drivers waved as they unloaded materials. Construction managers stopped for brief conversations before continuing to job sites. No one appeared tense. No one seemed afraid. At 8:15, a dark gray sedan pulled quietly into the reserved parking space. Thomas Rhodes stepped out carrying a worn leather briefcase. He looked nothing like the public image Daniel had seen online. There was no expensive suit, no security, no display of wealth. His gray coat had been repaired at one elbow. His shoes were polished but old. He paused at the sidewalk to hold the building's front door open for 2 interns balancing large architectural models. "Morning, Mr. Rhodes. Morning. How's your daughter doing?" "Much better. Fever finally broke. I'm glad to hear it." Thomas smiled warmly before disappearing inside. Daniel watched the exchange. Natural, not rehearsed. He crossed the street. The receptionist recognized him immediately. "Mr. Mercer, I'd still like to speak with Mr. Rhodes." She hesitated. "I'll ask." Several minutes later, she returned. "Mr. Rhodes has 15 minutes." Daniel followed her through a quiet hallway lined with photographs of schools, libraries, hospitals, and affordable housing projects. Every wall displayed buildings, not awards. Thomas stood as Daniel entered. "Mr. Mercer, thank you for seeing me. Please, sit down." The office surprised Daniel. Large windows overlooked the river, but the room itself was modest. A drafting table, bookshelves, family photographs, a wooden pencil holder worn smooth from years of use, no trophies, no framed magazine covers, no signs of prestige. Thomas noticed Daniel looking around. "I've never liked collecting awards, they gather dust." Daniel sat. Thomas poured 2 glasses of water. "What can I do for you?" "I'm investigating the Westbrook Apartments fire." Thomas's hand stopped for the briefest moment. Then he finished pouring the water. "I see, you lived there." "Yes, you moved out 3 days before the fire." "I did. Why, my lease ended." "Simple as that?" "Yes." Daniel opened his notebook. "Did you know Michael Turner?" Thomas nodded. "Everyone knew everyone. Small building." "Did you believe he caused the fire?" Thomas looked toward the window. "I believed he accepted responsibility." "That's different." "Yes, it is." Daniel noticed the answer. Careful, accurate, incomplete. "Did you ever doubt the investigation?" Thomas remained silent for several seconds. "I doubted many things after that fire." "Could you be more specific?" "No." Daniel waited. Thomas did not elaborate. Daniel changed direction. "You visit the memorial every year." "Yes." "You volunteer at the hospice." "Yes." Anonymous donations have supported several victims' families for years. Thomas met Daniel's eyes. "Have they?" Daniel watched for surprise. There was none. Interesting response. Not denial, not confirmation. Simply a question returned as a statement. "You're well informed. It's my job." Thomas folded his hands. "And mine is designing buildings. Neither of us should guess beyond what we know." Daniel closed the notebook. "Then help me know." Thomas smiled sadly. "If I could, I would." The interview ended there. Not because either man became angry, because neither had anything more they were willing to say. Thomas stood. "Thank you for coming." Daniel rose. "One last question." Thomas nodded. "Have you spent the last 20 years regretting one decision?" For the first time, Thomas's calm expression cracked, only slightly, enough for Daniel to notice. Thomas answered quietly. Every day, he opened the office door. "Goodbye, Mr. Mercer." Daniel left without another word. Outside, he wrote only one sentence. Regret confirmed. Not guilt, not innocence. Regret. His phone rang. "Lucas, I think I found someone you should meet." "Who?" "Retired building inspector. Worked Westbrook before the fire." "Name?" "Walter Green. Still alive. Barely, according to his daughter. Lives in a nursing home outside the city." Daniel looked back toward Thomas's office window. "Can he talk?" "She says his memory comes and goes. Sometimes perfectly clear, sometimes not." "I'll go today." The nursing home sat nearly an hour outside downtown. Walter Green was 91. Thin, frail, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm room. His daughter greeted Daniel quietly. Some days he remembers everything. Some days he doesn't remember breakfast. "I'll keep that in mind." Walter looked toward Daniel. "Reporter?" "Yes." "About the fire?" "Yes." The old man's eyes sharpened. "Westbrook, terrible place afterward." Daniel sat beside him. "Do you remember inspecting the building?" Walter nodded slowly. "Many times. Unsafe?" "No. Old, not unsafe. Electrical problems? Some. Enough to cause the fire?" Walter frowned. "Maybe, maybe not." Daniel leaned forward. "Do you remember Thomas Rhodes?" The old man's expression softened. "Kind young man, always fixing things for neighbors, never complained, always paid rent on time." Daniel wrote nothing. He wanted the old man to keep talking. Walter continued on his own. "Little girl liked him." "Which little girl?" "Emily, sweet child, always followed him around." Daniel's attention sharpened. Emily who? Walter struggled. Memory faded. He rubbed his forehead. Can't remember. Apartment? 3 or 2? His daughter gently touched his shoulder. It's all right, Dad. Walter looked back at Daniel. Fire wasn't supposed to happen. Nobody thought. His voice drifted away. Then suddenly returned. Clock. Daniel looked up. Clock, broken clock. Stopped. What clock? Apartment hallway. Always broken after. Walter frowned deeply. No, not hallway, apartment. Which apartment? Walter squeezed his eyes shut. Can't remember. His breathing became uneven. His daughter stepped forward. That's enough. Daniel closed his notebook. Thank you. As he reached the door, Walter spoke once more. Reporter. Daniel turned. Don't punish wrong man. Before Daniel could ask another question, confusion returned to the old man's face. Who are you? The moment had passed. Outside, rain began falling again. Daniel sat inside his car without starting the engine. Thomas, regret. Emily, broken clock. Wrong man. Every witness seemed to hand him another piece. None showed him where it belonged. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Only 6 words. You're getting closer than you should. No signature. No threat. Just another warning. Daniel looked through the rain toward the highway. For the first time in years, he found himself hoping the evidence would prove him wrong. Instead, every new fact made the mystery heavier. Daniel remained in the parked car long after the rain covered the windshield. The windshield wipers swept steadily back and forth. Each pass cleared the glass for only a moment before another layer of rain erased the view again. He opened his notebook. One page had become crowded with names. Thomas Rhodes, Evelyn Rhodes, Michael Turner, Walter Green, Captain Simmons, Emily. He drew lines between them. Most ended in question marks. One circle remained by itself. The wrong man paid. He stared at the words. Who had written them? Someone who knew the official story was incomplete. Someone who wanted him to investigate, but if that same person wanted the truth uncovered, why did someone else keep warning him to stop? The contradictions refused to disappear. His phone rang. Margaret. How did the interview go? Daniel started the engine but left the car in park. I've had easier ones. He talked. Enough. Useful? Daniel thought for a moment, not in the usual way. Margaret laughed softly. That's the Daniel Mercer answer. He admitted something. What? Regret, not guilt. No, not innocence either. Margaret became quiet. Sometimes those are different things. Daniel looked at the notebook again. I'm beginning to think they are. Anything else? Walter Green remembered a little girl named Emily, and something about a broken clock. Margaret frowned audibly. Broken clock? That's oddly specific. Exactly. Specific details usually survive when everything else fades, especially with elderly witnesses. Daniel nodded. That's why I'm writing it down. He ended the call and drove back toward the city. Night had already settled over downtown by the time he reached the newsroom. Most desks were empty. Only Lucas remained. Surrounded by stacks of scanned newspapers and city directories. You look terrible. Daniel hung his coat over his chair. Thank you, I mean tired. I know what you meant. Lucas slid another folder across the desk. I kept digging into Emily. Find anything? Not enough. There were 3 girls named Emily living in Westbrook apartments before the fire. 1 survived, 2 didn't. Daniel slowly opened the folder. Photographs, school records, resident lists. The faces stared back at him. Children frozen in ordinary moments. Birthday parties, school portraits, playgrounds. Daniel hated investigating old photographs. Pictures always looked complete. Reality never was. Which one knew Thomas? Lucas shook his head. No idea. Walter's memory wasn't specific enough. Daniel examined each picture carefully. One of the girls looked familiar. Not because he had seen her before, because she resembled someone. He couldn't place who. He closed the folder. We'll come back to it. Lucas leaned back. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Do you think Thomas did it? Daniel didn't answer immediately. 3 days ago, I would have said yes. Now I don't know what I think. Lucas looked surprised. You usually know, I usually have evidence. This time I have contradictions. Lucas smiled nervously. That's frustrating. No, it's dangerous, dangerous. When evidence points in different directions, people start believing whichever version they prefer. Our job is to resist that. Lucas nodded slowly. Daniel looked across the nearly empty newsroom. Years ago, he would already have reached a conclusion. Now, every new discovery delayed one. His desk phone rang. Internal extension. Reception. Daniel, there's someone here asking for you. Who? She wouldn't give a name. Daniel stood. I'll come down. The lobby was almost empty. A young woman stood near the entrance wearing a dark raincoat. She held a sealed envelope. When Daniel approached, she looked relieved. Mr. Mercer? Yes, she handed him the envelope. I was asked to give you this. By whom? I don't know. A man paid me this morning. Asked me to deliver it tonight. Did you see his face? Not clearly. He wore a cap. Anything else? She shook her head. He only said one thing. What? Tell him to stop looking at the wrong answers. Daniel looked down at the envelope. No name, no address. Just his own typed neatly across the front. When he looked up again, the woman had already walked into the rain. He returned upstairs without opening it. Lucas watched him. Another anonymous package? Looks like it. You going to open it? Daniel placed it on his desk. Not yet. Why not? Because whoever sent this expects me to react immediately. Lucas frowned, and I'd rather think first. He stared at the envelope for nearly a minute. It was thinner than the first one, only a few sheets inside. Finally, he broke the seal. A single black and white photograph slid onto the desk. Nothing else. No note, no explanation. The picture showed the entrance to Westbrook Apartments. The date was printed in one corner, 3 days before the fire. Several residents stood outside carrying moving boxes. Near the center of the image was Thomas Rhodes. Beside him stood Evelyn. They were loading furniture into a truck. Daniel's eyes moved to the background, high on the 4th floor. Someone stood in a window. The image was grainy, the face impossible to identify, but one detail was unmistakable: the apartment number beneath the window. 4C, Thomas's apartment. Daniel leaned closer. If Thomas and Evelyn were moving out, who was standing inside their apartment watching them leave? He turned the photograph over. One sentence had been written by hand. You're still missing the person who never left. Daniel looked back at the window in the photograph. For the first time, the mystery was no longer about why Thomas had moved away. It was about who had remained behind. Daniel did not sleep. The photograph remained on his desk long after everyone else had gone home. He had enlarged the 4th floor window until the image became little more than blurred shapes. No face. No identifying features. Only a silhouette. Someone had been inside apartment 4C after Thomas and Evelyn loaded their belongings into the moving truck. Whether that person had lived there, visited, or simply passed through, Daniel could not tell. He leaned back in his chair. The newsroom was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. His notebook lay open beside the photograph. One page listed only questions. Who remained? Why? Who took the photograph? Why wait 20 years to reveal it? His phone buzzed. A text message. Unknown number. Meet me tomorrow. 6 o'clock. Hospice Garden. Come alone. No signature. Daniel read it twice. He already knew who had sent it. The next day passed slowly. Lucas spent the morning searching property records and utility accounts connected to apartment 4C. Nothing unusual surfaced. No additional tenants. No unexplained visitors. Every document agreed that Thomas and Evelyn had officially moved out 3 days before the fire. Margaret stopped beside Daniel's desk. You look terrible. Didn't sleep. I can tell. She noticed the photograph. Anything useful? Maybe. That's never a comforting answer. Daniel slid the enlarged copy toward her. Someone was inside the apartment. Margaret studied it, or the photographer caught a reflection. Possible. Don't build theories from blurry photographs. I'm not. Good. She returned the picture. Where are you this evening? Daniel hesitated. Meeting a source. Anonymous? Probably. Be careful. Always. Margaret looked unconvinced. Not every danger announces itself. She walked away before he could answer. At 5:45, Daniel entered the hospice through the side gate. The evening air carried the smell of wet soil. The garden was quiet. Stone paths wound between flower beds and wooden benches. Several lanterns had already been switched on as daylight faded. Patients sat with family members beneath blankets. Others simply watched the trees move in the wind. Daniel spotted Evelyn immediately. She stood near a small fountain, her hands folded in front of her. She looked even more exhausted than before. "Thank you for coming. You asked me to." She nodded. They walked without speaking. Only after reaching the far end of the garden, where the conversations of visitors faded into the distance, did Evelyn finally stop. "I don't have much time, neither do I." She looked directly at him. "Please stop." Daniel had expected those words. He waited. She continued. "I'm asking you as one human being to another, not as Thomas's sister, not as a nurse, just—" She searched for the right words. "Someone who knows what happens if you don't." Daniel remained calm. "Help me understand." "I can't." "Why not?" "Because explaining would only make you ask more questions." "That's my job." "I know." She smiled sadly. "That's exactly why." Daniel studied her face. There were dark circles beneath her eyes, not from one sleepless night, from years of them. "You haven't asked to meet me because you think I'll listen." "No." "Then why?" "Because I needed to know whether you were the kind of man who could walk away." Daniel answered honestly. "I don't know, neither do I." She looked toward the hospice building. "Every day I watch families say goodbye. Some leave with peace. Some leave carrying anger they'll never put down. Some spend years wishing they had never learned certain things." Daniel folded his arms. "Truth doesn't create suffering, it reveals it. Sometimes." She met his eyes again. "Sometimes it creates new suffering too." Daniel did not respond. She took a folded photograph from her pocket. For a moment he thought she was finally going to hand him evidence. Instead, she held it tightly. "This was taken the week before the fire. Would you like to see it?" "Yes." She looked down at the photograph, then quietly slipped it back into her pocket. "I can't." Daniel frowned. "Why show me something you won't let me see?" "Because I wanted you to understand how difficult this is." He took a slow breath. "You know exactly what happened 20 years ago." She closed her eyes. "Yes." "Did Thomas start the fire?" Silence. "Did Michael Turner confess to protect someone?" Silence. "Was the investigation wrong?" Silence. Daniel waited. The fountain continued trickling behind them. Leaves drifted across the stone path. Finally, Evelyn spoke. "You're asking questions that deserve answers. Then answer them." "I can't." "Why?" "Because they don't belong to me." Daniel stared at her. The sentence unsettled him more than another refusal would have. "Not belong to you?" "The truth belongs to the people who have to live with it." He remembered Margaret saying newspapers report on people, not headlines. The thought irritated him. Facts didn't belong to anyone. Did they? Evelyn stepped closer. "Mr. Mercer." "Daniel," she nodded. "Daniel, have you ever regretted telling the truth?" He answered immediately. "No, not once." "No." She searched his face. "I don't believe you." Daniel blinked. "Why?" "Because anyone who's lived long enough has said something true they wished they had said differently." He had no answer. She wasn't accusing him. She sounded disappointed. She continued quietly. "Truth isn't only about whether words are accurate. It's also about when they're spoken, who hears them and who carries them afterward." Daniel looked away. The garden had grown darker. Lights glowed from patient rooms inside the hospice. Some windows showed families gathered around beds. Others showed only empty chairs. Evelyn followed his gaze. "Do you know why I became a hospice nurse?" "No." "Because dying people rarely ask whether they won arguments. They ask whether they loved enough, whether they forgave enough, whether they were forgiven." Daniel answered softly. That doesn't erase responsibility. No, it doesn't. Neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. If Thomas committed a crime, shouldn't the families know? Evelyn's voice almost broke. Which families? Daniel looked back at her. The question caught him off guard. She continued, the families who lost someone, or the families that exist today because people somehow kept living afterward? Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. She had not answered his question. She had made it larger. A nurse appeared at the garden entrance. Evelyn, he's asking for you. I'll be right there. She looked at Daniel one last time. Promise me one thing. I can't promise to stop. That's not what I'm asking. He waited. If you discover the truth, don't decide what it means until you've heard every voice. She hurried back toward the building. Daniel remained beside the fountain. The conversation had produced almost no new facts. No names, no evidence, no confession. Yet he left feeling less certain than when he arrived. As he reached the garden gate, someone called his name. Mr. Mercer, he turned. An elderly man sat alone on a nearby bench wrapped in a blanket. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. Daniel approached. Do I know you? The man smiled weakly. No, but... He coughed. I know Thomas. Daniel sat beside him. The old man looked toward the hospice building. Best man I've ever known. Daniel listened. The man reached into his coat pocket with trembling hands. Give him this. He placed a small brass key into Daniel's palm. Tell him, I never needed it. Before Daniel could ask what it opened, the nurses hurried toward the bench. The old man had lost consciousness. Daniel looked down at the worn key. A small paper tag still hung from its ring. Only 3 faded letters remained legible. For C, the apartment number from 20 years ago. Daniel stared at the key resting in his palm. It was old. The brass had darkened with age, and the edges were smooth from years of use. The paper tag looked as though it could fall apart if handled too roughly. For C, a nurse gently guided Daniel away from the bench. I'm sorry, he nodded. Is he? Very ill, she chose her words carefully. He has good days and bad days. Does he have family? A nephew visits sometimes, that's all I can really say. Daniel looked back. Several nurses surrounded the old man. One adjusted his oxygen. Another spoke softly into his ear. No panic, only practiced compassion. The same quiet dignity he had seen throughout the hospice. He slipped the key carefully into a small pocket inside his satchel. Not evidence. Not yet, just another unanswered question. As he walked toward the parking lot, his phone rang. Lucas, you busy? Always. I think I found the old tenant list for Westbrook. Daniel stopped beside his car. Go on. Apartment 4C officially lists only Thomas Rhodes. No Evelyn. Daniel frowned. That's impossible. She told me they lived there. She never actually said apartment 4C. Daniel replayed every conversation in his mind. Lucas was right. He had assumed they shared the apartment. Where was Evelyn registered? Apartment 3B. Daniel stood silently. Different apartment. Same building. Same moving date. Daniel looked back toward the hospice. Another assumption gone. Anything else? Actually, Lucas sounded uncertain. There's another name connected to 4C. Temporary occupant. No lease. Just an emergency contact filed with the building manager. Name? Records are damaged. Only first name survived. Emily. Daniel closed his eyes. The little girl. Maybe. No surname. Nothing readable. I'll keep digging. Daniel ended the call. The pieces shifted again. Thomas lived alone. Evelyn lived downstairs. Emily somehow belonged to apartment 4C, yet nobody had mentioned her except Walter Green. And the anonymous photograph showed someone still inside the apartment after Thomas moved away. He drove without turning on the radio. Rain returned before he reached downtown. His thoughts kept circling Evelyn's words. The truth belongs to the people who have to live with it. He disagreed. Didn't he? By the time he reached his apartment, it was nearly 10 o'clock. He rarely brought work home. Tonight he carried everything upstairs: photographs, court records, maps, his notebook. He spread them across the kitchen table, then added one more item: the key. He placed it beside the photograph of apartment 4C. His apartment was silent. No television, no music, only rain striking the windows. He studied the blurred figure in the fourth-floor window. Then the key. Then Thomas's interview, every day. Those words echoed inside his mind. Every day, not occasionally, not sometimes, every day. Daniel reached for a blank page. Instead of writing facts, he wrote names: Thomas, Evelyn, Michael, Emily, Walter, Captain Simmons, Margaret. Below them he wrote a single sentence: everyone protects someone. He stared at it, then slowly crossed out one name. Margaret. No, she wasn't protecting anyone, she was protecting him. The realization lingered. His phone vibrated. Another unknown number. He answered immediately. Daniel Mercer. No one spoke. Then Evelyn's voice. I heard about Mr. Collins. The patient? Yes, thank you for staying with him. Daniel looked at the key. He gave me something, I know. Silence settled between them. Do you know what this key opens? Yes. Then tell me I can't. Daniel sighed. Evelyn, please, just this once. Explain something. Her breathing trembled. If I explain one thing, everything else follows. Maybe it should, not tonight. Her voice cracked for the first time since they had met. Please don't make me be the one who starts this. Daniel heard someone call her name in the background. She whispered one final sentence. Thomas has been waiting 20 years for someone else to speak first. The line disconnected. Daniel remained frozen. Someone else. Not Thomas, not Evelyn, someone else. He looked at the key again, then at the blurred figure in the apartment window, then at Emily's name. For the first time, he considered a possibility that had never crossed his mind. What if the most important witness had never testified? He opened his notebook and wrote one final objective beneath every other question. Find Emily. Everything else could wait. Daniel unlocked the newspaper archive before sunrise. The building was silent except for the distant rumble of the printing presses below. He spread everything across the largest conference table: the official investigation, witness statements, court transcripts, building inspections, insurance reports, photographs, the anonymous packages, the brass key, his notebook. For the first time since receiving the envelope, Daniel stopped searching for individual clues. He began rebuilding the entire day. October 18. Thomas moved out. October 19. Moving truck returned to collect remaining furniture. October 20. Nothing recorded. October 21. The fire. He drew a long horizontal line across a blank page. Every verified event went onto the timeline. Nothing speculative, nothing anonymous unless clearly marked. 3 hours passed. Lucas arrived carrying breakfast. You've been here all night, almost. Lucas looked over the table. It resembled a map more than an investigation. Colored tabs connected dates. Photographs pointed toward witness statements. Court records overlapped engineering reports. You finally found something? Daniel shook his head. I found gaps. He pointed to the timeline. Look. Lucas leaned closer. Thomas moves. Evelyn moves. Fire. Turner confesses. Exactly what's missing? Lucas frowned. The fire itself. Daniel nodded. Everything after the fire is documented. Everything before the fire is documented. Almost nothing describes what actually happened during those 3 hours. Lucas looked confused. There were witness statements about smoke, sirens, people running. Not one reliable timeline inside the building. Daniel tapped another report because nobody survived from the 4th floor except. He stopped. Except who? Daniel turned another page. No one. Lucas blinked. Then who lived in apartment 4C after Thomas moved out? Daniel looked at the blurred photograph. That's exactly the question. He picked up the official fire department report. Time of emergency call. 9:42 p.m. First engine arrived. 9:48. Roof collapse. 10:16. Fire contained. 11:31. Fatalities confirmed the following morning. 6 officially identified immediately. The 7th required dental records. Lucas quietly asked children, too. Daniel closed the report. Neither spoke for several moments. Lucas finally broke the silence. I always forget investigations are about real people until he looked at the photographs. Daniel understood. Paper made tragedy feel distant. Faces never did. He gathered only the photographs and left. Where are you going? Westbrook. Again, I need to stop reading. I need to see. The memorial park stood nearly empty beneath gray skies. Wind carried fallen leaves across the pathways. Daniel walked directly to the memorial stone. 7 names, 4 adults, 2 children, 1 elderly resident. He copied each name into his notebook. Then he walked the perimeter. The original apartment building no longer existed, but the streets surrounding it had barely changed. An old grocery store still stood on the corner, a laundromat, a church. The alley beside the former building remained untouched. Daniel entered it. Behind the memorial park, remnants of the old foundations still broke through the soil. Concrete, rusted pipes, fragments of brick. Most visitors never came this far. He crouched beside a cracked section of foundation. The building's original layout returned from memory. Apartment 4C. 4th floor, facing east, he looked upward. A modern apartment building now occupied the neighboring lot. Its windows reflected the cloudy sky. 20 years earlier, those same windows would have reflected flames. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Looking for ghosts, Daniel turned. The elderly groundskeeper stood behind him holding a rake. Sometimes, the old man nodded. You journalists always come after something happens. Daniel smiled faintly. Usually. The groundskeeper rested the rake against a tree. I remember that night. Daniel waited. Not because I saw the fire, because I heard it. He frowned. Heard it, people, screaming, not many, just enough. Daniel took out his notebook. Do you remember anything else? The old man closed his eyes. One man kept trying to go back inside. Firefighters wouldn't let him. Who? Don't know. Young fellow, covered in soot, cried the whole time. Daniel's pulse quickened. Thomas? Maybe, didn't know his name, kept shouting. Shouting what? The old man struggled. Something about? Girl. Daniel looked up. Emily? The groundskeeper's eyes widened slightly. Yes, that sounds right. Daniel stopped writing. The old man continued quietly, thought he'd lose his mind. Firefighters held him down. Said roof was coming down. He kept trying anyway. Daniel asked softly, did he get back inside? No, nobody did. Silence settled between them. Daniel finally asked, why didn't you ever tell investigators? The groundskeeper looked genuinely surprised. Nobody asked. Daniel stared at him. For 20 years, no one had ever asked. He shook his head. Everybody wanted to know how fire started. Nobody cared what happened afterward. Daniel thanked him. As he walked away, those words refused to leave his mind. Nobody cared what happened afterward. By afternoon, Daniel sat inside the public library studying microfilm copies of local television coverage. Most reports focused on damaged buildings, investigation, arrests, political reaction. One station included amateur camcorder footage. The quality was terrible. Smoke covered nearly everything, but Daniel noticed a figure restrained by firefighters. The footage lasted only seconds. The man's face was impossible to identify, yet he fought desperately to reach the entrance. Daniel replayed the clip 6 times, then froze the final frame. His heart slowed. The man wasn't looking at the building. He was looking upward, toward the 4th floor, toward apartment 4C. Lucas called, "You're not going to believe this. Try me. I found the original emergency dispatcher logs. Anything useful? One line was never included in the public report." Daniel stopped the video. Read it. Lucas hesitated. First caller reported hearing someone trapped on the 4th floor, calling for Emily. Daniel closed his eyes. Everything became quiet, not because the mystery was solved, because it had just become personal. Someone inside that building hadn't been trying to escape. They had been trying to find a little girl. Daniel remained seated in front of the library computer. The dispatcher log stayed open on the screen. First caller reported hearing someone trapped on the 4th floor calling for Emily. He read the sentence again, then again. No mention of who had shouted. No mention of whether the voice belonged to a resident, a firefighter, or someone outside the building. Only one name, Emily. He printed the log, folded it carefully, placed it inside his notebook. Not proof, but no longer coincidence. His phone vibrated. Margaret, you sound different. Daniel hadn't spoken yet. How can you tell? You've been quiet for 5 seconds. That only happens when something surprises you. Daniel looked back at the dispatcher report. I found Emily again. Margaret waited. Dispatcher logs. Someone was calling her name from the 4th floor. She remained silent for a moment. Children change investigations. Daniel understood exactly what she meant. People could debate motives, negligence, responsibility, not children. He looked out through the library windows. Rain had begun again. I'm starting to think this case isn't about proving who caused the fire. Then what is it about? Daniel answered slowly, figuring out who everyone has been trying to save. He left the library before she could respond. The city streets were nearly empty. He drove toward the fire department archives. Captain Simmons had retired, but the department still maintained storage rooms filled with old incident reports and photographs. A young records officer met him. You're Mercer. That's right. Captain Simmons called this morning. He said you might come back. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Did he? The officer disappeared briefly. When he returned, he carried a smoke-damaged cardboard box. This wasn't part of the official archive. What's in it? Things investigators kept. Personal notes. Duplicate photographs. Nothing considered evidence. Daniel signed the receipt and carried the box to a reading table. Inside lay dozens of loose papers. Hand-drawn floor plans, radio transcripts, photographs never released publicly. Most showed burned hallways and collapsed ceilings. One photograph caught his attention immediately. A hallway clock, its glass shattered, its hands frozen. 9:51, Daniel's breathing slowed. Walter Green, broken clock. He turned the photograph over, recovered outside apartment 4C. Daniel stared at the words, outside, not inside. Another assumption corrected. He wrote carefully. Clock recovered outside 4C, stopped 9:51. Engine arrived 9:48. Roof collapse 10:16. What happened between 9:48 and 9:51? He continued searching. Near the bottom of the box sat a spiral notebook. The cover read simply, Captain Harold Simmons, Personal Notes. Daniel opened it. The handwriting was hurried. Unlike official reports, these notes contained uncertainty. 4th floor inaccessible. Residents reporting child still inside. Unconfirmed. Male attempting entry repeatedly. Restrained. Name unknown. Search impossible. Roof instability. Daniel turned the page. The final entry stopped him. No body recovered from apartment 4C bedroom. Search continued after collapse. Location uncertain. He frowned. Official records listed 7 victims. So why had the captain written that no body had been recovered? He checked the following page. A blank, the notebook ended there. His phone rang. Captain Simmons, you found my notebook. Daniel looked toward the cover. You knew it was there. I hoped you'd read it. Why wasn't this in the official report? Because those were field notes. Field notes aren't conclusions. Daniel remained quiet. Simmons continued. Do you know why investigators write notebooks? To remember details. No, to remember doubts. Official reports explain what we believe happened. Notebooks preserve everything we weren't sure about. Daniel looked again at the final page. No body recovered from apartment 4C bedroom. You never resolved this. No. Did someone remove the body before the search? I don't know. Was the report wrong? I don't know. Captain Simmons sighed. Mr. Mercer, sometimes history isn't rewritten because people lie. Sometimes it's rewritten because confusion hardens into certainty. The call ended. Daniel closed the notebook. The sentence echoed inside him. Confusion hardens into certainty. It sounded painfully familiar. How many of his own investigations had begun the same way? He carefully packed every document back into the box. Only copies of Captain Simmons's notes and the photograph of the broken clock accompanied him. Night had fallen by the time he returned to the memorial park. He stood alone before the stone listing the names of the dead. 7 names. He read each one slowly, then looked toward where apartment 4C had once stood. He imagined smoke filling the hallway, firefighters climbing stairs, residents screaming, someone desperately calling for Emily, someone else trying to force their way back inside. A broken clock stopping forever at 9:51. For 20 years, every conversation had centered on one question. Who caused the fire? Daniel looked down at his notebook. He crossed the question out. Beneath it, he wrote another. Who was everyone trying to save? The investigation had changed. Not because the evidence answered anything, because it finally revealed the question nobody had been asking. Morning light filtered through the newsroom windows as Daniel pinned Captain Simmons's field notes beside the official fire report. The 2 documents described the same night, yet they felt like accounts of different disasters. The official report was clean, organized, confident. The notebook was filled with crossed-out words, arrows, uncertain names, and questions left unanswered. Daniel preferred the notebook, not because it was more accurate, because it admitted what it did not know. Lucas arrived carrying 2 cardboard archive boxes, found something strange. Daniel looked up. Michael Turner's case file. Already read it, not all of it. Lucas placed a thin folder on the desk. These weren't included with the court transcript. Where did they come from? Public Defender's Archive. They donated old records to the university years ago. Daniel carefully opened the folder. Inside were handwritten interview notes from Michael Turner's attorney. The first page immediately caught his attention. Client repeatedly changes wording, never changes conclusion. Daniel turned another page. Question: Did you start the fire? Answer: I am responsible. Question: Did you personally ignite the fire? Long pause. I am responsible. Daniel read the exchange again. Different question. Same answer. Not the same meaning. He looked at Lucas. Did investigators notice this? No record that they did. Daniel continued reading. Another interview. Question: Were you alone? Answer: This is my fault. Question: Who else was present? Answer: Refused. Question: Why refuse? Because enough people have suffered. Daniel slowly lowered the pages. Lucas spoke first. That's not a confession. Daniel nodded. That's someone choosing his words very carefully. Another page. Psychological evaluation. Subject demonstrates extreme survivor's guilt, frequently accepts blame beyond direct responsibility. Daniel underlined the sentence, beyond direct responsibility. Margaret approached quietly. You both look like you've seen a ghost. Daniel handed her the interview. She read it without speaking. Finally, she looked up. He never actually admits causing the fire. Exactly. He accepts responsibility, not necessarily guilt. Margaret folded her arms. Lawyers should have caught this. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't care. Silence settled over the newsroom. Daniel gathered his coat. Where are you going? Michael Turner's widow. Lucas looked surprised. I thought she died years ago. No, she disappeared. There's a difference. Lucas frowned. How do you disappear? Margaret answered. By wanting to. 3 hours later, Daniel stood outside a small house on the edge of the city. Fresh paint. well-kept garden, no mailbox displaying a family name. Privacy seemed intentional. He knocked. An elderly woman opened the door. "Mrs. Turner, I haven't used that name in many years." Daniel introduced himself. She looked tired before he had spoken a single question. "You're investigating Westbrook." "Yes." She stepped aside. "Come in." The living room was simple. Books, plants, family photographs turned slightly away from visitors. She noticed him looking. "Some memories are private." Daniel nodded. She poured tea. "You want to know whether Michael started the fire. I want the truth." She smiled sadly. "Everyone says that." Neither spoke until the tea had cooled. Finally, Daniel asked, "Did your husband cause the fire?" She looked directly at him. "No." Daniel felt no triumph, only silence. She continued, "He believed he did." "That's different." "Explain." She shook her head. "I can't explain everything." "Can you explain that?" Michael was the maintenance supervisor. When something broke, he blamed himself. Even if he hadn't touched it, even if someone else had. She looked down at her hands. After the fire, he couldn't separate responsibility from guilt anymore. Daniel remembered the psychological evaluation. Beyond direct responsibility. Did he confess to protect someone? Her eyes filled with tears. He confessed because he believed someone had to. Daniel remained perfectly still. Someone had to? The city demanded answers. Families demanded answers. Reporters demanded answers. Everyone wanted a name. Michael gave them one, his own. Daniel's notebook remained closed. He wanted no interruption. Mrs. Turner continued quietly. He kept saying the same thing. "If people need someone to blame, let it be me." Daniel finally spoke. Why? Because he believed the dead deserved peace, and the living deserved to stop searching. She wiped away a tear. He was wrong. Daniel asked softly, did he know who was actually responsible? A very long silence followed. Then she answered, "Yes." Daniel's heartbeat slowed. "Who?" She looked toward the window. "I promised him." Daniel did not move. She continued, "He asked me never to tell anyone, even after he died." Daniel leaned forward. "Mrs. Turner, an innocent man went to prison." She corrected him immediately. "No, a guilty man went to prison, just not guilty of what everyone believed." Daniel stared at her. She realized what she had said, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I shouldn't have said that." Daniel understood. Michael Turner had been hiding something, but it wasn't his own crime, it was someone else's. "Mrs." Turner covered her face with one hand. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Daniel did not press her. He had learned that silence often revealed more than interruption. Finally, she lowered her hand. "Michael wasn't a perfect man. I never believed he was. He made mistakes. He drank too much after long shifts, missed birthdays, forgot anniversaries. He could be stubborn, but he wasn't cruel." She looked toward an old bookshelf. He couldn't live with the idea that children died under his care. Daniel quietly asked, even if he didn't start the fire, especially then. She stood and walked to the shelf. From a wooden box, she removed a folded letter. The paper had yellowed with age. She held it for a long moment before handing it to Daniel. He wrote this before sentencing. Daniel unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was steady. "If you're reading this, then I couldn't carry this weight any longer. Please don't spend your life defending me. I made my choice because someone had to end the anger. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe truth should have mattered more. But I couldn't watch another family disappear while everyone searched for someone to hate. I don't expect forgiveness, only peace. Take care of yourself." Michael, Daniel read the letter twice. It never mentioned innocence. It never admitted guilt, only sacrifice. Mrs. Turner watched him. He believed prison would end the story. Instead, she looked around the quiet room. It never ended. Daniel folded the letter. "Did investigators ever see this?" "No." "Why not?" "Because Michael asked me to burn it." "You didn't." She shook her head. "Some promises become too heavy." Daniel returned the letter. "Thank you." She accepted it without another word. As Daniel reached the front door, she spoke again. Mr. Mercer, he turned, if you find the truth, don't let people use it as another excuse to hate someone. He nodded once. Outside, the afternoon rain had stopped. Clouds drifted apart just enough to let pale sunlight reach the street. His phone buzzed. Lucas, I found Emily. Daniel stopped walking. Alive? No. School records, family records, photographs. Emily Carter, 8 years old, lived in apartment 4C. Daniel frowned. Apartment 4C? With Thomas, officially listed as his emergency contact. No parents. Lucas hesitated. Both parents died before she moved in. Daniel's mind raced. Who was raising her? That's the strange part. There are no guardianship records. Nothing legal. It's as if... Lucas stopped. As if what? As if someone was taking care of her without the system knowing. Daniel looked back toward Mrs. Turner's house, the little girl in the neighborhood photograph. Thomas holding her hand. Walter saying she followed Thomas everywhere. Someone calling for Emily during the fire. The emergency contact. Apartment 4C. Everything pointed toward one conclusion. Thomas hadn't simply known Emily, he had loved her. Lucas continued. There's something else, go ahead. Hospital records show Emily was treated twice for asthma during the year before the fire. Daniel remembered the dispatcher log. Someone trapped on the 4th floor. Smoke, asthma, his stomach tightened. Thank you, he ended the call. Back inside his car, Daniel opened his notebook. Under Emily Carter, he wrote, orphan, lived with Thomas, unconfirmed. Asthma, age 8. He stared at the page. The image of Thomas forcing his way toward the burning building became painfully clear. Not chasing guilt, trying to save a child, his phone rang again. Captain Simmons, I heard you visited Mrs. Turner. News travels fast, small city. Daniel looked through the windshield. She told me Michael knew the truth. The captain remained silent. You already knew that, didn't you? Another silence. Finally, Simmons answered, I suspected. Why didn't you investigate further? Because I had no evidence, only instincts. Daniel gripped the steering wheel. If Michael wasn't protecting himself, who was he protecting? Simmons answered with complete honesty. That's the one question I could never answer. The call ended. Daniel drove without deciding where he was going. Instinct eventually carried him back to the memorial park. The names carved into the stone no longer looked like victims. They looked like pieces of an unfinished conversation. He stopped in front of one name, Emily Carter, 8 years old. He reached into his satchel and removed the photograph of the neighborhood barbecue. Thomas smiled beside Evelyn. Between them stood Emily. She held Thomas's hand, not awkwardly, not timidly, comfortably, like she belonged there. Daniel suddenly noticed something he had missed before. Around Emily's neck hung a small silver pendant. He froze. He had seen it before, not in another photograph. At the hospice, Mr. Collins, the elderly patient who had given him the brass key. The same pendant had rested against his chest when Daniel spoke with him. Different people, same necklace. He turned the photograph over. Nothing. No names, no notes, only the date. Daniel looked toward the skyline. 20 years. Someone had carried a key. Someone had kept a photograph. Someone had waited. And now, somehow, an old hospice patient held a piece of the same story. The fire had never truly ended. It had simply burned more quietly. Daniel arrived at the newspaper before dawn with one question occupying every page of his notebook. Where had Thomas Rhodes been every year after the fire? Not where people remembered seeing him, where his money had gone, where his time had disappeared, where his life had quietly unfolded beyond newspaper profiles and architecture awards. Lucas was already waiting. I couldn't sleep either. Good, because we're done looking backward. Lucas frowned. What do you mean? Daniel spread financial records across the table. If Thomas has been hiding something for 20 years, he hasn't only hidden a secret, he's hidden 20 years of choices. Lucas immediately understood. Follow the life, not the crime. Exactly. The anonymous donations had always been impressive. Now Daniel wanted to know everything: amounts, dates, recipients, patterns. Most of the transfers passed through charitable foundations, educational trusts, housing initiatives, medical grants. Every layer obscured the original donor. But whoever designed the network had made one mistake: consistency. The donations never missed a year. Never. Economic recessions, market crashes, pandemics, nothing interrupted them. Lucas pointed at one spreadsheet. Every October, Daniel looked. The largest annual donation always arrived during the same week. The anniversary of the fire, not random, intentional. Margaret joined them carrying coffee. "Please tell me one of you remembered breakfast." Neither answered. She sighed. "Take the coffee anyway." Daniel accepted the cup without looking away from the records. Someone spends 20 years anonymously giving away millions, always the same week, always to families connected with Westbrook. Margaret quietly asked, "What would you call that?" Lucas answered first. "A guilty conscience." Daniel shook his head. "No, routine." Margaret looked at him. "Explain." "Guilt fades, habits don't." This wasn't someone reacting emotionally every year. This was someone who built an entire life around remembering. Margaret said nothing. Daniel continued, "That's different." Lucas leaned over another folder. The money wasn't only for victims. Daniel looked up. Who else? Neighborhood organizations, scholarships, community gardens, public libraries, low-income housing. Daniel frowned. Not random charity, investment. Lucas nodded. Everything stayed within 3 miles of Westbrook. Daniel circled the area on a city map. He wasn't trying to escape the fire. He stayed beside it. The realization lingered. Most guilty people fled reminders. Thomas had built his life around one. By noon, they had identified nearly 40 separate charitable organizations. Different names, different directors, different paperwork. One accountant appeared repeatedly. Grace Holloway. Daniel wrote the name down. Retired. Lives nearby. An hour later, they sat inside a modest accounting office converted into a home. Grace Holloway welcomed them politely. She had expected reporters many years earlier. Not now. 20 years is a long time. Daniel placed several financial statements on the table. "You prepared these." She adjusted her glasses. "Yes." "Who was your client?" "Confidential." "Even after retirement?" "Especially after retirement." Daniel remained calm. Were these donations connected to Westbrook Apartments? Grace looked toward the window. "I can't answer that." "Can you answer whether the donor intended to remain anonymous forever?" She smiled faintly. That was the entire point. "Why?" Grace folded her hands. "Because gratitude was never supposed to belong to one person." Daniel considered that answer. "Did your client ever miss a payment?" "Never. Not once. Even when projects failed, especially then." Daniel noticed something unusual. "You admire this person." Grace did not deny it. "I've spent my career helping wealthy people avoid taxes. Only one ever asked how to quietly help strangers without receiving credit." Daniel leaned forward. "Was that Thomas Rhodes?" Grace smiled again. "You already know I won't answer that." Daniel nodded. "I had to ask." She stood. "Before you leave, may I ask you something?" "Of course. If you discover who funded those lives, what will you do with that knowledge?" Daniel answered honestly. "I don't know yet." She looked relieved. "Good, because certainty is dangerous in stories like this." Daniel recognized the sentence. Not certainty, assumption. That had become the enemy. Back at the newsroom, Lucas had another surprise waiting. "I traced several scholarship recipients. Anything interesting?" One became a teacher. Another opened a medical clinic. One became a firefighter. Daniel slowly looked up. "Firefighter." Lucas nodded. His parents died at Westbrook. Daniel stared at the list. The money hadn't simply helped people survive. It had changed lives, entire futures. Children who might never have escaped poverty now had careers. Families who could have collapsed had remained together. Communities had slowly healed, quietly, without anyone knowing why. Daniel closed the folder. For the first time since receiving the anonymous envelope, he wondered whether exposing the donor might destroy something beautiful instead of protecting it. His phone vibrated. Unknown number, he answered. Daniel Mercer. The familiar woman's voice returned. You've been following the money. Yes, then you've started seeing him. Daniel frowned. Seeing who? The man he became. The call nearly ended. Wait, Daniel spoke quickly. Was every donation his? A pause, then the answer. Every apology. The line went dead. Daniel remained motionless. She had not confirmed Thomas's name. She had answered a different question, and somehow, it hurt even more. Daniel lowered the phone slowly. Every apology, not every donation, every apology. He wrote the words in his notebook exactly as she had spoken them. Lucas looked up from across the newsroom. Another anonymous call. Daniel nodded. She didn't answer my question. What did she say? Daniel turned the notebook toward him. Lucas, read the sentence twice. That's not an answer. No, it's a confession without a confession. Margaret arrived moments later. She noticed both men staring at the page. Something happened. Daniel explained the conversation. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quietly. Do you know what troubles me? Daniel shook his head. Nobody has defended Thomas by claiming he's innocent. Lucas looked between them. You're right. Everyone avoids that word. Margaret nodded. Evelyn doesn't say he's innocent. Mrs. Turner didn't. Captain Simmons didn't. Not even the anonymous caller. Daniel felt the weight of that realization. Every person who knew the truth refused to erase Thomas's responsibility. Yet none of them wanted him condemned either. It was as though everyone had independently reached the same impossible conclusion. Lucas broke the silence. Can someone deserve blame and forgiveness? No one answered. Daniel looked back at the financial records. Grace Holloway had unknowingly given him something more valuable than a name: perspective. He spent the afternoon visiting addresses connected to the anonymous charities. A neighborhood library. Children filled the reading room after school. An elderly volunteer greeted him. Beautiful place. It wasn't always. Daniel introduced himself. The woman smiled. You're writing about the renovation? Not exactly. Who funded it? She laughed. Anonymous donor. Best kind. Why? Because children don't care whose name is on the wall, they only care the roof doesn't leak. Daniel walked through the building. Fresh shelves, new computers, comfortable chairs, nothing extravagant, only useful. He imagined the building before the renovation. Old, neglected, forgotten. Outside, he crossed the street to another address: affordable housing. Families sat on balconies while children rode bicycles through the courtyard. A maintenance worker recognized him. Reporter? Yes. If you're here about the donor, good luck. Nobody knows. Do people ask? Not anymore. Why not? The worker shrugged. After 20 years, Anonymous starts feeling normal. Daniel thanked him. His final stop was a small community clinic. Photographs covered one hallway. Children, parents, doctors, volunteers. One framed picture caught his attention. The ribbon-cutting ceremony from 15 years earlier. No donor stood at the front. Instead, dozens of neighborhood residents held the ribbon together. A nurse noticed him studying it. That's my favorite picture. Why? Because whoever paid for this wanted all of us to share the credit. Daniel looked at the photograph again. No speeches, no spotlight, no applause, only a community reclaiming something it had lost. He returned to his car as evening settled across the city. His notebook remained closed on the passenger seat. For once, facts alone felt inadequate. He thought about Thomas. Every October, every donation, every hospice visit, every white lily left beneath the memorial tree, every apology. His phone buzzed. Lucas, one more thing, go ahead. I finally identified Mr. Collins. Daniel straightened. The hospice patient, his full name is Arthur Collins, retired carpenter, lived across the hall from Thomas. Apartment 4B, Daniel's pulse quickened. Neighbor, yes, anything else? Lucas hesitated. Arthur never married. No children, but what? He was listed as Emily Carter's emergency contact before Thomas. Daniel gripped the steering wheel before Thomas, 6 months before. Daniel closed his eyes. Emily had not simply appeared in Thomas's life. Someone had entrusted her to him. Lucas continued. Arthur disappeared from public records for almost 10 years after the fire. Hospital stays, psychiatric treatment, long-term care. Daniel remembered the pendant. The key, the tears in Arthur's eyes. Tell him, I never needed it, he suddenly understood. The key had never been meant for Daniel. It had been meant for Thomas, 20 years late. Daniel started the engine. Where are you going? The hospice. Why? Because Arthur tried to give something back before he died. I think. Daniel looked toward the darkening skyline. He's finally ready to tell someone why. As the rain began once more, Daniel drove through the city with a growing certainty that frightened him. The truth had never been hidden because it was difficult to discover. It had been hidden because every person who carried it had believed someone else deserved to speak first. And after 20 years of waiting, there might not be much time left. Daniel reached the hospice just after sunset. The reception desk was quieter than usual. Only a single volunteer remained, organizing paperwork beneath a warm lamp. Daniel approached, Arthur Collins. The volunteer's expression softened. You're too late. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He passed away an hour ago. The words settled heavily, not because Daniel had known Arthur well, because another voice had disappeared before speaking. The volunteer continued gently. He wasn't alone. Someone stayed with him. Thomas, the volunteer nodded. He came as soon as we called. Daniel looked toward the hallway leading to the patient rooms. Is he still here? Hospice garden. Daniel thanked her and walked outside. Rain had finally stopped. The garden glistened beneath the lights. Thomas sat alone on the same bench where Arthur had given Daniel the brass key. His hands rested quietly on a folded blanket. He didn't look surprised when Daniel approached. Arthur died peacefully. Daniel nodded. I'm sorry. Thomas smiled faintly. So am I. For a while, neither man spoke. The silence felt respectful rather than uncomfortable. Finally, Daniel reached into his satchel. Arthur gave me this. He placed the brass key on the bench between them. Thomas stared at it. 20 years, his voice was almost a whisper. I wondered where it had gone. Do you know what it opens? Thomas nodded. Apartment 4C. Daniel waited. Thomas picked up the key carefully, running his thumb across the worn metal. Arthur always said he'd return it. Looks like he finally did. Daniel looked directly at him. He wanted to tell me something. Thomas closed his hand around the key. I know, did he ever tell you? No, the answer surprised Daniel. Thomas continued. Arthur spent 20 years believing he didn't deserve to speak. Daniel remembered Evelyn's words, everyone waiting for someone else. Thomas looked toward the flower beds. He was wrong. Daniel asked quietly, then why didn't you speak? Thomas closed his eyes. Because I promised. Promised who? He did not answer. Instead he asked, have you ever broken a promise, Mr. Mercer? Daniel thought, no. Thomas smiled sadly. I have more than one, not that one. Daniel remained silent. Thomas continued. Some promises become heavier than truth. Daniel immediately replied, truth shouldn't depend on promises. No, Thomas agreed. But people do. Before Daniel could respond, Evelyn quietly entered the garden. She had clearly been searching for them. Arthur asked for you before he lost consciousness. Thomas nodded. I know. Did he say anything? Only that he was tired. Thomas looked at the key again. He carried far too much. Evelyn noticed Daniel watching them. There's something both of you deserve to know. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. She looked at Thomas. May I? Thomas nodded once. 20 years ago, Thomas tried to confess. Daniel froze. Confess, the morning after the fire. He walked into the police station. Daniel slowly looked toward Thomas. He said nothing. Evelyn continued. He intended to tell them everything he believed had happened, everything he thought was his fault. Daniel whispered what stopped him. Thomas answered this time. Michael Turner. Daniel stared. Thomas looked at the ground. He was already there, already confessing. Daniel felt the world narrow. You let him? No. Thomas's voice cracked. I tried to stop him. Evelyn quietly continued. Michael refused. He told Thomas to go home. Thomas shook his head. I refused. We argued for hours. Daniel listened without moving. Thomas's eyes remained fixed on the ground. Michael kept saying the same thing. This ends with me, not you. Daniel spoke softly. Why? Thomas swallowed. Because he believed. He looked toward Evelyn. No, he knew. He knew people needed someone to blame. Daniel asked, did you tell the police the truth anyway? Thomas's silence answered first. Then came one word. No. Daniel closed his notebook without writing anything. Thomas continued. I walked out. Coward. Evelyn immediately interrupted. No. Thomas ignored her. Every day since then, I've wondered whether walking away was the worst decision of my life. Daniel finally asked the question he had carried for days. Did you start the fire? Thomas looked directly into his eyes. Tears filled them. Then he answered, I believe I did. Not certainty. Belief. Daniel immediately noticed the distinction, just like Michael. No one in this story spoke in absolutes anymore. Thomas stood slowly. I don't know whether that's enough for you. He walked toward the hospice entrance. Daniel remained seated beside Evelyn. Neither of them moved for several minutes. Finally, Daniel spoke. He still doesn't know. Evelyn nodded. No, he never has. Daniel watched Thomas disappear into the hospice. The garden fell silent again. Only the sound of water moving through the small fountain remained. He looked at Evelyn. You already knew. Yes. About the confession? Yes. About Michael stopping him? Yes. Daniel searched her face. How long have you carried this? 20 years. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because it wouldn't have answered your question. It answers part of it. Exactly. Part of it. Daniel leaned back against the bench. Thomas believes he started the fire. Michael believed he should accept responsibility. Neither one speaks with certainty. Evelyn nodded because certainty died that night. Daniel frowned. Explain that. She slowly shook her head. I can't. Not because I don't want to, because if I explain one piece, the rest no longer belongs to me. Daniel almost laughed again. That phrase. Who does it belong to? She looked toward the hospice building. The people who survived, not the people who watched from outside. Daniel followed her gaze. Arthur survived. Yes. Michael survived. Yes. Thomas survived. Yes, you survived. She looked down. Yes. Daniel waited. She did not continue. There was another survivor. Wasn't there? Evelyn closed her eyes. Daniel, please don't ask me that tonight. He knew she had answered without speaking. There had been someone else. His phone buzzed. Lucas, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead. I found something in the courthouse archives. Daniel stood. What is it? There was a sealed motion filed 6 months after Michael Turner's sentencing. By who? Thomas Rhodes. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. What kind of motion? Request to reopen the investigation. Daniel looked at Evelyn. Was it granted? Lucas answered immediately. No, withdrawn before the hearing. Withdrawn? Yes. Signed by Thomas himself. Daniel thanked him and ended the call. He turned back toward Evelyn. He tried again. She nodded. Yes. Why withdraw it? I can't answer. Did Michael ask him to? Silence. Did someone else? Silence. Daniel exhaled slowly. Every important answer lived inside silence. Evelyn stood. Visiting hours are almost over. She took several steps before stopping. Daniel, he looked up. Thomas never stopped trying to confess. He just stopped believing anyone should listen. She walked back toward the building. Daniel remained alone in the garden. The statement echoed inside him, not stopped trying, stopped believing. There was a difference, a profound one. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the courthouse archives before opening hours. A clerk recognized him. "Mr. Mercer, you called yesterday." "I did." The clerk disappeared into a storage room. When she returned, she carried a thick-sealed file, most of it's procedural. Daniel accepted it. "Thank you." He spent the next 2 hours reading every page. Thomas's attorney had prepared an extraordinary petition. The filing requested that Michael Turner's conviction be vacated and that the investigation into Westbrook Apartments be reopened because newly available testimony fundamentally challenged the original findings. Daniel's eyes moved rapidly across each page. The petition never identified the new witness, never identified the new testimony. Instead, it repeatedly stated that an individual with direct knowledge wished to correct the historical record. Attached to the filing was a handwritten letter from Thomas. He requested permission to speak under oath. He accepted whatever legal consequences might follow. He asked only that Michael Turner no longer carry responsibility for something that belonged elsewhere. Daniel read the final paragraph 3 times. "I cannot continue living while another man bears a burden that should at least be shared. If the law determines I deserve punishment, I will accept it without appeal. I ask only that the truth be heard completely." Daniel slowly lowered the page. He had expected self-defense. Instead, he found surrender. He continued reading. 3 weeks later, the petition had been voluntarily withdrawn. No explanation, no hearing, no testimony, nothing, only Thomas's signature. Margaret arrived shortly after noon. Lucas had called her. She quietly sat beside Daniel. "You found it." He handed her the letter. She read silently. When she finished, she folded it carefully. He meant every word. Daniel nodded. "Yes." Margaret looked toward the courthouse windows. People don't usually spend 20 years hiding after writing something like this. No, something changed. Daniel stared at the withdrawal notice, or someone changed it. He turned the page over. A single handwritten note had been added in different ink. No signature. Only one sentence. "Some truths arrive too late to heal." Daniel immediately compared the handwriting. Not Thomas, not the attorney. Someone else had written it, someone who had seen the file before it disappeared into storage. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. He answered. Daniel Mercer. The familiar woman's voice spoke almost in a whisper. "You found the petition." "Yes." "Why was it withdrawn?" A long silence followed. Then she answered. "Because another innocent family was about to lose everything." The line disconnected. Daniel remained perfectly still. Another innocent family. Not the victims, not Michael Turner's. Someone else's. He looked down at Thomas's letter. For 20 years, he had believed the investigation centered on one impossible choice: publish or stay silent. Now he realized the real choice had been made decades earlier. Someone had already decided that revealing the complete truth would create more victims than it would save. And Daniel was getting dangerously close to discovering why. Daniel carried Thomas's letter back to the newsroom without reading it again. He already knew every sentence, not because he had memorized the words, because he had begun carrying their weight. The newsroom buzzed with its usual energy. Phones rang. Editors argued over headlines. Televisions replayed political scandals. A young reporter celebrated landing an exclusive interview. Life continued. Margaret noticed Daniel standing motionless beside his desk. Bad day. Daniel placed the letter in front of her. "Read the last paragraph again." She did. When she finished, she looked up. "You're not thinking about Thomas, you're thinking about yourself." Daniel didn't answer. That was answer enough. Lucas hurried over. "I found another article." Daniel barely looked up. "Which one?" "One of yours, published 17 years ago." Daniel frowned. "Why?" Lucas laid an old newspaper on the desk. Front page. City Council corruption. Daniel remembered it immediately. Councilman Richard Hale, Bribes, kickbacks, public contracts. He had exposed everything. Hale resigned, went to prison. Daniel had won his first National Journalism Award. Lucas quietly asked, "Do you remember what happened afterward?" Daniel answered automatically. His conviction was upheld. Not Hale, his family. Daniel looked at him. Lucas continued carefully. His wife lost her job. His son dropped out of college. His daughter changed schools after harassment. Daniel stared at the faded newspaper. He had never followed the story beyond the conviction. Margaret folded the paper. "Do you regret publishing it?" Daniel answered immediately. "No, neither do I." She paused. "But justice isn't free." The words settled heavily. Daniel walked to the archive room. Thousands of newspapers surrounded him. Entire decades of headlines. Every edition had once felt like a victory, every truth uncovered, every lie exposed. He slowly removed several bound volumes. Stories he had written, corporate fraud, political bribery, medical corruption, environmental crimes, human trafficking, most had unquestionably improved lives. Some had imprisoned dangerous people. Some had saved lives. Yet, he also began noticing the photographs beside those headlines. Families, children, spouses, people who had never committed a crime. Collateral damage. He had rarely wondered what happened to them afterward. Lucas entered quietly. "You okay?" Daniel remained looking at the shelves. "How many people have I hurt?" Lucas frowned. "The guilty ones? No, the innocent ones." Lucas had no answer. Neither did Daniel. Later that afternoon, Daniel visited Richard Hale. The former councilman now worked in a warehouse outside the city. Older, gray-haired, thinner. He immediately recognized Daniel. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again." Daniel nodded. "Neither did I." Richard set down a heavy box. "Come to write another story?" "No, to ask one question." Richard smiled bitterly. "Only one?" Daniel met his eyes. "Did I do the right thing?" Richard laughed softly. "You really picked a strange day to ask that." "Why?" "Because my son called this morning. First time in 3 years." Daniel waited. Richard leaned against a loading dock. "You exposed every crime I committed. You were right. Every word." Daniel remained silent. "Then why do you look unhappy?" Richard looked toward the parking lot. "Because my wife died believing our family was being punished for my sins." Daniel felt something tighten inside him. She wasn't guilty. "No, neither were my children." He looked back at Daniel. "But neither were you." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean? You didn't destroy my family." "I did. You only turned on the lights." Daniel absorbed the sentence. Richard continued. "Would I ask you not to publish it if we lived it again?" "Yes." "Would I be right?" "No." Daniel spoke quietly. "Your children paid a price. They did." Richard nodded. "Truth always sends the bill to more than one person." Daniel looked away. Richard picked up the box again. "If you're asking whether truth hurts innocent people, the answer is yes. Always. The question isn't whether people suffer. It's whether they are suffering because of truth or because of what someone chose to hide before it." Daniel drove away without turning on the radio. By evening, he found himself outside the hospice once more, not because he expected answers, because it had become the quietest place in the city. Evelyn was trimming flowers in the garden. "You keep coming back, so do you." She smiled faintly. Occupational hazard. Daniel sat on the same bench where Thomas had held the brass key. "Do you think journalism helps people?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. "I think people help people. Jobs only give them opportunities." Daniel looked at her. "I've always believed facts were enough." She placed the gardening shears on the bench. "Facts explain, people forgive, those aren't the same thing." Daniel remembered every investigation, every headline, every award, every celebration in the newsroom. He had measured success by accuracy, never by healing. Evelyn spoke softly. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If you publish Thomas's story tomorrow, who sleeps better tomorrow night?" Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came out. She continued. "Who heals, who becomes whole, who finds peace?" Daniel searched for an answer. He couldn't find one, only another question. Then why does the truth matter? Evelyn looked toward the flower beds Arthur had loved, because someday, the right people need it, not always everyone. Daniel sat there long after she returned inside. Rain began falling again. He didn't move. For the first time since becoming a journalist, he realized he had spent 20 years asking whether a story was true. He had almost never asked who it was truly for. When he finally returned to the newsroom, Margaret was waiting. She held a thin folder. This arrived after you left, no return address. Daniel opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Thomas, much younger, standing beside Michael Turner. The two men were shaking hands, neither smiled. Written on the back, in careful handwriting, were 6 words. The day we chose silence together. Daniel stared at the photograph. Until that moment, he had believed Michael chose for Thomas. Now he understood something far more painful. Thomas had chosen too, and that choice had shaped every life that followed. The photograph remained on Daniel's desk overnight. Thomas, Michael, a handshake, 6 words. The day we chose silence together. By morning, the image had stopped looking like evidence. It looked like a promise. Daniel arrived before anyone else. He unlocked the archive room. Instead of researching Thomas, he searched journalism itself. Old ethics manuals, editorial policies, historic front pages. Margaret found him sitting on the floor surrounded by books. Planning to rewrite the profession, Daniel looked up. Maybe. She sat beside him. What's bothering you? I've spent my career asking whether people deserve the truth. She waited. Now I'm wondering whether that's even the right question. Margaret smiled sadly. Good, Daniel frowned. Good, most journalists never reach that question. She picked up one of the ethics books. When I started, my editor gave me one piece of advice. What was it? He said people confuse 2 very different things every day. Daniel waited. Public interest, public hunger. Daniel repeated the words. What's the difference? Margaret closed the book. Public interest is information people need in order to make decisions. Public hunger is information people desperately want because it satisfies curiosity. Daniel remained silent. She continued. Sometimes they are the same. Sometimes they're worlds apart. She stood. Come with me. They left the newspaper building together. Margaret drove without explaining where they were going. Half an hour later, they stopped outside a small apartment building. Ordinary. Quiet. Children's bicycles leaned against the entrance. Who lives here? Richard Hale's daughter. Daniel slowly looked at her. You knew where she lived. I checked on her years ago. Why? Because your story changed her life too. Daniel felt uncomfortable before they even entered. A young woman opened the door. She immediately recognized Margaret. Good to see you again. Margaret smiled warmly. This is Daniel Mercer. The woman's smile disappeared. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then she stepped aside. Come in. Her apartment was modest but welcoming. Children's drawings covered one wall. A little boy played quietly with toy trains on the floor. My son. Daniel nodded politely. The woman poured coffee. I wondered whether we'd ever meet. Daniel answered honestly. I didn't think I deserved to. She appreciated the answer. Your article was true. Daniel looked at her. Every word. Then, why are you here? Because I don't know whether truth was enough. She looked toward her son. When I was 16, everyone at school knew my last name. Teachers looked at me differently. Parents stopped inviting me over. My friends disappeared. Daniel listened without defending himself. She continued, I hated you. For years. He accepted that. Then I hated my father. Longer. She smiled faintly. Eventually, I hated nobody. Daniel quietly asked, Do you wish I hadn't published the story? She looked directly into his eyes. No, he blinked. My father broke the law. People deserve to know. Daniel felt both relief and sorrow. She continued, but nobody deserved what happened afterward. What do you mean? News vans stayed outside our house for weeks. Photographers followed my little brother to school. Strangers shouted at my mother in grocery stores. None of us had done anything. Daniel lowered his eyes. The woman leaned forward. Mr. Mercer, your article served the public interest. Everything after publication served public hunger. Daniel looked up. She continued. People already knew enough. They simply wanted more. More interviews, more photographs, more suffering. Silence filled the room. Margaret said nothing. She wanted Daniel to hear every word. The woman looked toward her son again. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm grateful corruption was exposed, but curiosity became entertainment. That's where compassion disappeared. Daniel whispered, I'm sorry. She smiled gently. You're the first reporter who's ever said that. Outside, Margaret and Daniel walked without speaking. Finally, Daniel asked, Why bring me here? Because you've been asking the wrong question. Daniel stopped walking. Margaret faced him. The question isn't whether Thomas's story is true. It is. The question isn't whether publishing would be legal. It would. The question is simpler. She looked directly at him. Who benefits? Daniel immediately thought of readers. Awards, newspapers, public debate. Then he thought of Evelyn, Thomas, Michael's widow, Arthur, Emily, victims' families. He could no longer separate them. Margaret continued. If exposing Thomas heals those who suffered, publish. If exposing him only satisfies millions of strangers, think harder. Daniel asked quietly, How do I know the difference? Margaret smiled. That's why editors exist. Back at the newsroom, Lucas rushed toward them. I found the missing witness. Daniel froze. What? The witness Thomas planned to present when he filed the petition. Who? Lucas handed him a faded visitor log from the county jail. The only person who visited Michael Turner the day before Thomas withdrew the petition. Daniel looked at the name. His heartbeat slowed. Evelyn Rhodes. He stared at the page. No. Lucas pointed to the signature. She visited him alone, 2 hours. The day after that, Thomas withdrew everything. Margaret slowly exhaled. Daniel looked at the visitor log again. Until now, he had believed Evelyn had only protected Thomas after the decision had already been made. The record suggested something very different. She had been part of the decision itself. His phone vibrated. A text message from an unknown number. 1 sentence. She never asked him to stay silent. She asked him to choose carefully. Daniel looked from the message to the visitor log. Someone knew exactly what he had just discovered, and they were still watching every step he took. Daniel read the message 3 more times. She never asked him to stay silent. She asked him to choose carefully. It answered one assumption. It created 10 more. Lucas looked over his shoulder. Same anonymous sender? Probably. Can you trace it? Lucas gave him a look. If I could, we'd already know who they are. Daniel slipped the phone into his pocket. No, whoever this is, they want me to discover the truth. Just not too quickly. Margaret nodded. They're controlling the pace, not the destination. Daniel returned to his office. He closed the door. For the first time in years, he ignored every assignment waiting on his desk. Instead, he pulled a blank sheet of paper from his drawer. Across the top, he wrote 2 columns, public interest, public hunger. He began listing everything he knew. Thomas caused the fire, public interest. Michael accepted responsibility, public interest. A wrongful conviction, public interest. Anonymous donations, possibly public interest. Thomas's private guilt. He stopped writing. Which column did that belong in? He couldn't answer. Thomas's medical records. Public hunger. Thomas's conversations with Arthur. Unknown. Emily's asthma. Not public interest. Private. Michael's farewell letter. He stared at it. A confession or grief. He folded the page in half. For the first time in his career, the facts refused to organize themselves. There was no line separating what people needed to know from what they merely wanted to know. Only judgment. And judgment frightened him far more than evidence ever had. Late that afternoon, he left the office alone. The city moved around him as always. Trains rattled overhead. Office workers hurried home. Street musicians played beneath bridges. No one passing him knew he carried a story that could dominate every newspaper in the country. No one knew he no longer wanted that. His steps eventually carried him back to Westbrook Memorial Park. The rain had washed the stone clean. 7 names, 1 tree, white lilies rested beneath it. Fresh ones. He looked around. The park was empty. Someone had been there only minutes earlier. He knelt beside the flowers. A folded envelope rested underneath them. No stamp, no name, only one word. Daniel. He carefully opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. You keep asking whether people deserve the truth. Arthur asked the same question. Michael asked it. Thomas asked it. You are asking the wrong one. There was no signature, only another photograph. It showed the old community center 5 years after the fire. Children laughed outside. Parents stood together. The building looked newly restored. Daniel immediately recognized several faces: former scholarship recipients, volunteers, families he had seen in the clinic photographs. Then his eyes stopped. Standing in the background, almost hidden behind a tree, were Thomas and Evelyn. Neither faced the camera. Neither appeared to know the photograph had been taken. Thomas was repairing a broken fence. Evelyn handed bottled water to volunteers. No speeches, no ceremony, no recognition, just work. Daniel turned the photograph over. 1 sentence. Ask who loses. He closed his eyes. Public interest, public hunger, who benefits? Now another question. Who loses? Each question narrowed the path. Yet none gave him permission to publish. His phone rang. It was Evelyn. Her voice sounded calmer than usual. Can we meet tonight? Yes. Where? The old public library. After closing, Daniel frowned. Why there? Because there's something I can finally show you. Can finally? She hesitated. Thomas agreed. Daniel stood immediately. Agreed to what? To let someone else carry part of the truth. The line ended. Daniel looked once more at the photograph. Thomas had finally made a decision, not to confess, not yet, but to stop carrying everything alone. As darkness settled over the city, Daniel walked toward the library with the strange feeling that every question he had asked since receiving the anonymous envelope had only been preparation. The investigation was no longer about uncovering hidden facts. It was about deciding whether knowing them would leave anyone's life better than before, and for the first time, someone was ready to trust him with the answer. Daniel reached the old public library just as the last lights inside were being switched off. The building stood between newer office towers, overlooked by most people walking past it. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and polished wood. Evelyn waited near a reading table. She carried no files, no photographs, no folders, only a small leather journal. You came, you asked me to. She gestured toward a chair. Please sit. Daniel remained standing. You said Thomas agreed to let someone else carry part of the truth. He did. Where is he? Evelyn looked toward the staircase. Upstairs, reading room. He's been waiting. Daniel climbed the stairs alone. The room overlooked the dark streets below. Thomas stood beside a tall window with his hands behind his back. For several seconds, neither man spoke. This was the first time they had met without a hospital room, a memorial, or an unexpected encounter surrounding them. Thomas broke the silence. I almost canceled. Why didn't you? Because Evelyn convinced me that hiding from you wasn't protecting anyone anymore. Daniel slowly walked closer. Do you know why I'm here? I think so. Tell me anyway. Daniel stopped a few feet away. I want to understand why 2 good men chose to let one carry the blame. Thomas looked out the window. You're still assuming we were both good men. Were you evil? No, then you're proving my point. Thomas gave a tired smile. Life isn't generous with those choices. Daniel removed his notebook. For the first time since beginning the investigation, he left it closed. Thomas noticed. No notes, not tonight. Thomas nodded once. Good, because this isn't an interview. Daniel leaned against the table. Then tell me where it starts. Thomas took a slow breath. Not with the fire, with my father. Daniel listened. He expected an explanation. Instead, he received context. My father believed mistakes were weakness. If I broke something, he demanded perfection. If I failed, he demanded more. Nothing was ever enough. Daniel remained silent. I grew into someone terrified of disappointing people. Successful, respected, reliable, everything looked perfect. Thomas laughed quietly, until one night proved it wasn't. Daniel finally asked, "Were you drinking?" Thomas answered immediately. Yes, no excuses, no hesitation, just truth. I had celebrated winning a contract, too much whiskey, too much confidence. I shouldn't have driven. I shouldn't have gone back to the apartment. I shouldn't have. His voice broke. He stopped speaking. Daniel waited. Thomas continued after several seconds. Everything after that belongs to 100 tiny decisions, not one big one. Daniel frowned. Explain. People think disasters happen in one moment. They don't. They happen because dozens of ordinary mistakes line up. One forgotten repair. One delayed inspection. One bad decision. One tired maintenance worker. One broken smoke detector. One drunk architect. Daniel's heartbeat slowed. Not one villain. A chain. Thomas nodded. Exactly. Daniel finally understood why certainty had vanished. Everyone involved had carried one link. No one had carried the entire chain. Thomas looked directly at him. Do you know why I hate being called generous? Daniel shook his head. Because people think generosity cancels guilt. It doesn't. Nothing cancels guilt. You just learn to carry it without letting it poison everyone around you. Daniel asked quietly, "Is that why you spent 20 years rebuilding the neighborhood?" Thomas smiled sadly. No, I rebuilt it because it was still broken, not because I thought it would forgive me. Silence settled again. Daniel finally asked the question he had delayed for days. If you could go back, would you confess? Thomas answered without hesitation. Immediately. Then why didn't you 20 years ago? Thomas closed his eyes. Because someone showed me the cost. Daniel waited. Michael, no. Evelyn, no. Then who? Thomas looked toward the staircase. Emily. Daniel stared at him. Emily, she was 15. She had already lost her parents, already lost her home, already believed the world had abandoned her. Thomas's voice became quieter. She asked me one question. Daniel leaned forward. What did she ask? Thomas swallowed. If they take you away too, will everyone leave me? The room became completely silent. Daniel slowly lowered his head. Thomas continued. She didn't know the whole story. She only knew everyone she loved kept disappearing. Daniel whispered, "So you stayed?" I stayed. Not because I wanted freedom, because I couldn't watch another child lose everything. Daniel looked toward the floor. For the first time, Thomas's silence felt less like cowardice, more like sacrifice. Yet, Michael still went to prison. Thomas saw the conflict on Daniel's face. That's why there was never a right answer. Only different people paying different prices. The door behind them opened quietly. Evelyn entered. Neither man noticed at first. She looked at Thomas. It's time. Thomas nodded. He reached into his coat, then placed a thick sealed envelope on the table. My complete statement. Everything, every name, every date, every mistake I remember. Daniel looked at the envelope but made no move to touch it. Thomas gently pushed it closer. I've spent 20 years deciding whether the world deserves this. Tonight, I'm letting you decide. Daniel stared at the envelope. It felt impossibly heavy. Thomas placed one hand on it before Daniel could reach for it. One condition. Daniel looked up. Read it, understand it. Then ask yourself one question before you publish anything. What question? Thomas met his eyes. When justice is finally done, who will still be left to forgive? Thomas removed his hand. Daniel slowly picked up the envelope. For the first time since receiving the anonymous package that began the investigation, the entire truth was finally within reach. and he had never wanted to open it less. Daniel held the envelope without breaking the seal. The room remained silent. Thomas made no effort to persuade him. Evelyn simply watched. Finally, Daniel asked, "Why me?" Thomas answered immediately, "Because you still haven't decided." Daniel frowned. "Decided what? Whether you're looking for truth or permission?" The words landed harder than any accusation. Daniel looked down at the envelope. "I've always believed they were the same thing." "I know," Thomas nodded. "So did I." He walked toward one of the old bookshelves. Rows of worn biographies filled the shelves. Histories, wars, trials, presidents, judges, people remembered for impossible decisions. Thomas rested his fingers on the spine of one book. Every one of these people believed they were right. Some were, some weren't, most never knew. Daniel remained quiet. Thomas continued, "You've spent your career proving facts. Now you're being asked to judge consequences. They're different skills." Daniel slowly nodded. "Yes." Thomas looked relieved. "That's all I wanted you to understand. Not that I'm innocent. Not that I deserve forgiveness. Only that whatever you choose, someone innocent will pay." Daniel felt those words settle inside him. For weeks he had searched for the guilty. Now Thomas was asking him to search for the innocent instead. Evelyn stepped beside the window. "Daniel, do you remember asking me who the truth belongs to?" "Yes, I think I was wrong." Daniel looked at her. Truth belongs to everyone touched by it, not at the same time, not in the same way, but eventually, everyone. Daniel considered her words, then he looked at the sealed statement. "If I read this, there's no going back." Thomas nodded. "No, there isn't." Another long silence passed. Daniel finally slipped the envelope into his satchel. "I'm not opening it tonight." Thomas smiled for the first time. A small, tired smile. "Good." Daniel looked surprised. "You expected me to. I hoped you wouldn't." "Why?" "Because curiosity opens envelopes. Responsibility waits until morning." Daniel let out a quiet breath. Margaret had spoken about public hunger. Thomas had just demonstrated the same lesson, without ever mentioning journalism. As they walked downstairs together, the library lights dimmed automatically. The building was closing. At the entrance, Thomas stopped. "Mr. Mercer," Daniel turned. "If you decide to publish everything, I won't stop you. If you decide not to, I won't thank you." Daniel frowned. "Why not?" "Because neither decision should belong to me anymore." He extended his hand. For the first time since the investigation began, Daniel accepted it. The handshake was firm, unremarkable. Human, no photographers, no audience, no witnesses beyond Evelyn. Yet Daniel somehow knew it would become the most important handshake of his life. Thomas released his hand. "Good night." He and Evelyn walked into the rainy street together. Daniel remained beneath the library entrance, watching them disappear into the darkness. His phone buzzed. "Lucas, you need to come back." "What's happened?" "Someone broke into your office." Daniel's heartbeat quickened. "Was anything taken?" Lucas hesitated. "No, not taken. Left." Daniel immediately headed for the newsroom. Police officers were already inside. His office door hung open. Nothing appeared disturbed. His notebooks remained exactly where he had left them. His computer was untouched. Margaret stood beside his desk. They only touched one thing. She pointed. At the center of his desk sat an old newspaper, yellowed with age. Daniel recognized it instantly. The original front-page edition covering the Westbrook fire. Across the headline, written in fresh black ink, were 6 words, "You still do not know everything." Daniel slowly turned the page. Inside, tucked between 2 articles, rested a folded sheet of paper. Unlike every anonymous note before it, this one was signed, Michael Turner. Daniel's hands froze. Lucas stared over his shoulder. "That's impossible." Daniel carefully unfolded the page. The first line read, "If you are reading this, then Thomas finally found the courage I prayed he would." Daniel looked toward the sealed envelope inside his satchel. Thomas had finally entrusted him with his own truth. Now, somehow, Michael Turner was about to tell him his. The two stories had remained separate for 20 years. By sunrise, they would become one. Daniel locked his office door. For several minutes, he did nothing. Thomas's sealed statement rested beside Michael Turner's letter. 2 lives, 2 versions, 1 truth. He reached for Michael's letter first. The paper had yellowed with age. The handwriting was careful but uneven. If you are reading this, then Thomas finally found the courage I prayed he would. Please do not hate him more than he already hates himself. Daniel continued reading. I have watched one man sentence himself every day for 20 years. No judge could have punished him more severely. If you wish to understand what happened, begin with this. Neither of us intended to lie. We simply failed in different ways. Daniel paused. He opened Thomas's envelope. Inside were nearly 50 handwritten pages. The first sentence matched Michael's almost perfectly. If these pages have reached you, I have finally accepted that silence can become another form of selfishness. Daniel leaned back. Even separated by decades, their thoughts echoed one another. He read until sunrise. Page after page reconstructed the night of the fire. Thomas had returned to Westbrook shortly before midnight after celebrating the successful approval of a major architectural proposal. He had been drinking, not enough to lose consciousness, enough to make poor decisions feel reasonable. Rain had begun falling. The building's electrical system had experienced intermittent failures for months. Residents had complained repeatedly. Management delayed repairs to reduce costs. Thomas knew this. He had argued about it during previous renovation consultations. He should have pushed harder. He didn't. That failure stayed with him. The night he returned, he noticed lights flickering in the 4th-floor hallway. Arthur Collins was replacing temporary wiring after another electrical failure. Michael Turner was checking a leaking pipe nearby. Thomas offered to help. Arthur refused. Go home. You've celebrated enough tonight. Thomas admitted he laughed. He should have listened. Instead, he remained, trying to prove he was still useful, trying to prove alcohol hadn't affected him. Daniel kept reading. The maintenance storage room contained paint, solvents, old wiring, and damaged electrical equipment waiting for disposal. None of it should have remained there. Thomas remembered smelling something unusual, burned insulation. Michael noticed it too. Arthur went searching for the source. Then everything happened at once. A loud crack, darkness, sparks, smoke, someone shouted. Thomas ran toward the storage room. Michael ran toward the apartments. Arthur tried reaching the electrical panel. The first explosion wasn't large. The second was. Daniel turned another page. Thomas described carrying 2 children downstairs, returning for another resident, falling debris, heat, confusion. Nobody understood exactly where the fire had begun. Nobody saw the entire sequence, only fragments. The statement never attempted to excuse Thomas. Instead, it listed every decision he regretted. I should not have returned after drinking. I should have insisted the city close the building months earlier. I should have forced the contractor to document every violation. I should have ignored my pride and listened when Arthur told me to leave. Each sentence ended identically. I did not. Daniel finally reached the section describing the police investigation. Thomas wrote that he entered the station intending to confess everything he remembered. Before he could speak, Michael stopped him. Michael insisted the investigation already centered on individual negligence, not systemic failure. If Thomas confessed publicly, attention would shift. The property company would escape scrutiny. The city inspectors would escape scrutiny. The manufacturers of defective equipment would escape scrutiny. Everything would become Thomas Rhodes versus the world. Daniel stopped reading. He unfolded Michael's letter again. The corresponding paragraph read, Thomas believed punishing himself would create justice. I knew it would create a scapegoat. Neither of us understood there could be another path. Daniel continued. Thomas explained that Michael accepted responsibility for maintenance failures because many genuinely fell under his supervision. He had signed inspection reports, delayed replacement requests, approved temporary repairs. Those decisions were real. So were Thomas's. So were management's. So were the city's. Everyone owned part of the disaster. The legal system demanded one name. Reality refused to provide one. Daniel read until the final pages. Thomas described withdrawing his petition years later, not because he stopped wanting the truth, because Michael's widow visited him, not Evelyn, Michael's widow. She showed Thomas photographs. Emily, graduating high school, starting college, laughing for the first time in years. She asked him one question. If Michael carried this burden so she could have a future, will you destroy the future he chose? Thomas wrote only one answer. I signed the withdrawal before sunset. Daniel slowly lowered the papers. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Come in. Margaret entered. She looked at the pages covering the desk. You know now, Daniel nodded. Yes. Who caused the fire? Daniel answered after a long pause. Everyone. Margaret looked relieved. Then you understood. Daniel handed her Michael's letter. She quietly read several paragraphs. When she finished, she asked the question Daniel had feared. What are you going to publish? Daniel looked out the window. Morning light spread across the city. People hurried to work, completely unaware that one decision inside a quiet newsroom could redefine 20 years of history. He finally spoke. I still don't know. Another knock came at the door. Lucas entered. Sorry to interrupt. Thomas Rhodes is downstairs. Daniel looked up. He said he'd wait as long as necessary. He only asked me to tell you one thing. What? Lucas swallowed. Whatever you decide. He won't appeal it. Thomas had already accepted the verdict. Now only Daniel's remained. Daniel left the papers exactly where they were. For the first time in his career, he refused to carry evidence into an interview. He already had enough. Thomas stood alone in the lobby. He had removed his coat despite the cold. His face looked more tired than Daniel had ever seen it. You read everything. Yes, Thomas nodded. Then there isn't much left to explain. Daniel disagreed. There is one thing. They walked outside. Rain fell lightly over the empty sidewalk. Neither man seemed to notice. Daniel stopped beneath the awning. Why didn't you leave? Thomas looked confused. After the fire. You could have disappeared, started over somewhere else. No one would have known. Thomas almost smiled. I would have known. Daniel said nothing. Thomas continued. People think punishment is prison. Sometimes it's waking up every morning remembering exactly who you used to be. Daniel looked at him carefully. Do you forgive yourself? Thomas answered without hesitation. No, will you? I don't know. Thomas accepted that. Neither do I. They began walking without choosing a direction. Daniel broke the silence. Michael called himself a scapegoat. You called yourself a coward. Which one was true? Thomas looked ahead. Both, neither. Words become too small after enough years. Daniel thought about that. You tried to confess twice. Yes, why not a third time? Thomas stopped walking, because eventually, confessions stopped being about courage. It became about ownership. Daniel frowned. Explain, if I confessed after Emily built a life, after Michael died, after Arthur spent decades blaming himself, who would I be helping? Daniel answered honestly. The public. Thomas nodded. Maybe, who else? Daniel couldn't answer. Thomas looked toward the courthouse in the distance. The law measures responsibility. Life measures consequences. Those aren't always the same thing. Daniel remembered every conversation. Margaret, Richard Hale, Evelyn, Arthur, Michael's letter. Each had pushed him toward the same place from a different direction. Thomas reached into his pocket. One final item. He handed Daniel a folded photograph. The edges were worn smooth. Daniel opened it. It showed 7 children standing together in front of the rebuilt community center. Emily stood among them, all smiling. On the back, Thomas had written a date. Every child in this picture lost someone at Westbrook. Daniel turned the photograph over again. Thomas spoke quietly. 6 of them finished college. 1 became a firefighter. 1 became a teacher. 1 became a nurse. Emily became. He stopped himself. Daniel finished the sentence. A good person. Thomas smiled. Yes, Daniel stared at the children. None of them knew the man standing behind the camera carried part of the reason they were standing there at all. Thomas asked softly, if you publish everything, what becomes the first thing people say when they see that photograph? Daniel already knew. Children raised with blood money. Thomas nodded. They'll never again be allowed to simply be survivors. They'll become evidence. Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not certainty, understanding. His phone rang. Lucas, Daniel, we've got a problem. What happened? Another newspaper got the story. Daniel stopped walking. What? Someone leaked enough documents to connect Thomas to Westbrook. Who? We don't know. They're preparing a front-page investigation. When? This afternoon. Daniel's heartbeat accelerated. How much do they have? Not everything. Enough to start asking questions. Enough to ruin him if they guess the rest. Daniel ended the call. Thomas had heard enough. It's begun. Daniel looked at him. You knew this might happen. I always knew. Are you afraid? Thomas looked toward the cloudy sky. No, only sad. For who? Everyone. Daniel immediately returned to the newsroom. Margaret and Lucas were already waiting. A competing newspaper had sent advance copies to subscribers. The headline covered nearly half the page. National hero hiding deadly secret? No evidence. No context, only speculation. Margaret placed the paper on the conference table. This is public hunger. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, they don't know enough to tell the truth, only enough to feed curiosity. Lucas looked between them. What do we do? Daniel picked up Thomas's statement, then Michael's letter. Finally, the anonymous photographs. For the first time, he understood exactly what responsibility felt like. Not power. Wait. Margaret watched him. You have until noon. After that, everyone will be chasing the story. Daniel looked through the conference room window. Reporters rushed between desks. Phones rang without stopping. The entire newsroom sensed something enormous approaching. None of them knew the real story. Daniel quietly gathered every document into a single folder. He took one last look at the rival newspaper's headline. Then he said the words that surprised even himself. We're not racing them. Lucas blinked. We're not. Daniel shook his head. No, we're deciding whether they deserve to lose. Silence filled the room. No one asked who he meant. The answer had become far too complicated. The newsroom had become louder than Daniel had ever heard it. Televisions replayed the rival newspaper's headline every few minutes. Commentators filled empty spaces with speculation. Social media had already decided Thomas Rhodes was either a monster or the victim of a conspiracy. Almost nobody admitted they did not know enough. Lucas hurried toward Daniel. 3 television networks called. Every one of them wants a statement. Tell them we're verifying facts. That's all, that's all. Lucas left. Daniel entered the conference room carrying the folder that now contained 20 years of lives. Margaret closed the door behind him. No interruptions. For a while, neither of them spoke. Daniel spread everything across the table. The anonymous documents, Arthur's testimony, Michael's letter, Thomas's confession, the photographs, the visitor log. Each piece had once felt like another step toward exposing a criminal. Now they resembled pieces of a life no headline could honestly contain. Margaret finally spoke. What story do we actually have? Daniel answered automatically. Thomas Rhodes caused. He stopped. No. He took a slow breath. Try again. Daniel looked at every document. A respected architect hid his role in a deadly fire. Margaret waited. Daniel frowned. Still incomplete. He tried once more. Several people shared responsibility for a tragedy. One innocent man accepted legal blame. Another spent 20 years trying to repay a debt that could never be repaid. Margaret nodded slightly. Closer. Daniel leaned back, still not enough. He realized something uncomfortable. Every truthful summary felt dishonest. Not because it contained falsehoods, because it left something essential behind. Lucas entered carrying coffee. Sorry, I know you said no interruptions. Margaret looked up. What is it? He handed Daniel a printed draft from the rival newspaper's website. The article had already been updated. Now it included photographs of Thomas entering the hospice. A paragraph speculated that he might be receiving treatment for guilt-induced stress. Another questioned whether anonymous donations to community charities had been attempts to buy silence. Daniel lowered the pages. They don't know. No. Lucas shook his head. They're guessing. Margaret looked at Daniel. That's what happens when facts arrive without context. Lucas hesitated. Shouldn't we publish first, before they create the narrative? Daniel remained silent. Lucas continued, if we have the truth. Isn't it our responsibility? Daniel looked at him. What truth? Lucas blinked all of this. He gestured toward the documents. Daniel slowly shook his head. These are facts, that's not the same thing. Lucas looked confused. Daniel picked up one photograph, Thomas repairing a fence. Who is this? Thomas Rhodes, correct. He picked up another. Thomas carrying children during the fire. Who is this? Thomas again. Same man? Yes. He lifted the confession, the man who caused part of the tragedy. Same man? Yes. Finally, he held Michael's letter. The man another person believed deserved a second chance. Same man? Lucas nodded more slowly. Yes. Daniel placed every document side by side. Which one is the truth? Lucas opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Daniel answered for him, all of them, and none of them alone. The room became quiet. Margaret watched Lucas carefully. This was the lesson she hoped he would remember for the rest of his career. Daniel returned to his office. He opened a blank document on his computer. Headline. He stared at the empty line. Thomas Rhodes exposed. He deleted it. The secret behind Westbrook. Deleted. The man responsible, deleted, 20 years of lies, deleted. Each headline felt designed to make readers curious. Not wiser, he closed his eyes. His fingers rested on the keyboard. Slowly, he began typing. Not a headline, a question. What does society owe the truth? When the truth has already punished everyone involved, he read the sentence several times. It sounded less like journalism, more like an essay. Margaret quietly entered. That's not a news article. I know, she looked at him. Maybe that's because this isn't a normal story. Daniel turned toward her. If I write everything, I'll destroy Thomas. Yes, if I write nothing. The rival paper controls the story. Yes, if I publish only part, people will accuse me of protecting him. Yes, Daniel laughed softly. You've become very economical with words. There are no economical answers. He rubbed his forehead. Tell me what to do. Margaret smiled sadly. No, why not? Because if I make this decision, you'll spend the rest of your life believing it was mine. Daniel knew she was right. His phone vibrated. Evelyn, he answered immediately. Are you all right? There was silence. Then Evelyn spoke quietly. Thomas collapsed. Daniel stood. What happened? He was talking with me. Then he couldn't breathe. The doctors are with him now. Daniel's heart sank. Is he? I don't know. Please come. The line ended. Daniel looked at the unfinished article, then at Thomas's confession, then at the rival newspaper's accusations spreading across every screen in the newsroom. Time had finally run out. He closed the laptop without saving a single word. For the first time in his professional life, the story could wait. The man could not. Daniel arrived at the hospice less than 15 minutes later. Rain covered the entrance steps. Several reporters already stood behind temporary barriers. Someone had leaked Thomas's medical emergency almost immediately. Cameras pointed toward every arriving car. Nobody knew whether Thomas was alive. They only knew there might be a story. Daniel walked past them without answering a single question. Inside, the building was almost silent. The contrast felt unbearable. Outside, people searched for information. Inside, people searched for hope. Evelyn stood outside Thomas's room. Her hands were folded tightly together. "How is he?" "Stable for now." Daniel let out a slow breath. "Can I see him?" She nodded. "Only for a few minutes." Thomas looked smaller than Daniel remembered. Oxygen tubing rested beneath his nose. Machines quietly measured each heartbeat. He opened his eyes as Daniel approached. "You came." "Of course," Thomas smiled faintly. "You closed the laptop." Daniel froze. "How did you?" "Evelyn tells me more than she should." Daniel almost smiled. Thomas's expression became serious. "Have you decided?" "No." "Good." Daniel pulled a chair closer. "I thought you wanted me to decide quickly. I wanted you to decide carefully. There's a difference." Daniel nodded. Thomas looked toward the window. "Do you know what I regret most?" Daniel expected another answer about the fire. Instead, Thomas said, "Time." Daniel waited. "I spent 20 years believing I had more of it. More time to help, more time to confess, more time to become someone worthy of forgiveness." He looked back at Daniel. "There never was more time, only today." Daniel felt every word. Thomas continued. "Don't wait because you're afraid. Don't publish because you're afraid. Fear has already made enough decisions." Daniel quietly asked, "Then what should make this one?" Thomas smiled weakly. "Love." Daniel looked at him. "Not love for me. Not for Evelyn. Not for Michael. Love for the people who have to live with whatever comes next." The room fell silent. Daniel had spent weeks hearing different versions of the same lesson. Margaret spoke of responsibility. Richard spoke of consequences. Evelyn spoke of healing. Thomas spoke of love, different words. One truth. A nurse entered. "Mr. Rhodes needs to rest." Thomas nodded. Before Daniel stood, Thomas reached for his wrist. "One last request." Daniel leaned closer. "When people read whatever you write, don't let them remember me. Remember Westbrook. Remember the families. Remember why buildings must be safe. Remember why pride destroys people. If my name becomes the story." Then I failed again. Daniel slowly nodded. "I understand." Thomas released his hand. As Daniel stepped into the hallway, Evelyn was waiting. She could tell from his face that the conversation had changed something. "Did he ask you not to publish?" "No." "Did he ask you to publish?" "No." She smiled sadly. "That sounds like Thomas." Daniel looked through the window into the hospice garden. Flowers bent beneath the rain. "I finally understand something." "What?" "This was never a choice between truth and compassion." Evelyn listened. "It was always a choice about what the truth was actually for." She closed her eyes for a moment. "Thank you." Daniel looked at her. "For what?" "For finally asking that question." A television mounted in the waiting room suddenly switched to breaking news. The rival newspaper had released a second article. This one contained Thomas's photograph, his full name, his home address, speculation about murder charges, anonymous sources, unverified accusations. One sentence flashed across the bottom of the screen. "More revelations expected throughout the day." Daniel watched patients in the waiting room quietly reading the report on their phones. Some recognized Thomas's face. Others looked toward his room. Whispers began spreading. A frightened elderly patient asked a nurse, "Is that the man down the hall?" The nurse had no answer. Daniel looked away from the television. The damage had already begun, not because the complete truth had been revealed, because an incomplete truth had. His phone rang. "Margaret." "Daniel, I've made a decision." He listened. "Come back. Bring every document. Don't write the article yet." "Why?" "Because I think we've been trying to write the wrong story." Daniel glanced back toward Thomas's room, then toward the television. Then at the frightened patients whose peaceful mourning had become another news cycle. For the first time since the investigation began, he believed Margaret might be right. The biggest story of his career was never Thomas Rhodes. It was journalism itself. Daniel drove back through streets lined with satellite trucks. Every news station wanted the next development. Every website refreshed by the minute. Every commentator spoke with confidence built on incomplete information. The closer he came to the newsroom, the less certain he became that journalism still remembered how to wait. Margaret was standing alone in the conference room. Every document remained spread across the table exactly as Daniel had left it. She did not ask about Thomas. She already knew the answer from Daniel's face. He's getting weaker. Daniel nodded. She looked at the empty computer screen. We're not writing an investigation. Daniel sat down. Then what are we writing? Margaret slid a blank sheet of paper toward him. Start with one sentence. Not about Thomas, about what you've learned. Daniel stared at the page. His hand refused to move. Margaret waited. Minutes passed. Finally, Daniel wrote, "Facts alone cannot decide what justice looks like." Margaret read it, crossed it out. Why? Because you're still teaching, not telling the truth. Daniel frowned. Isn't that the truth? No, it's your conclusion. Start earlier. Daniel tore the page away. He tried again. I have spent 20 years believing. He stopped. Margaret nodded. Now you're getting somewhere. Daniel continued writing. I have spent 20 years believing that my responsibility ended when every fact had been verified. Today I learned that responsibility begins there. Margaret quietly smiled. Keep going. Words came slowly, not because Daniel lacked them, because each sentence felt permanent. He wrote about certainty, about consequences, about innocent people standing behind every headline. He never mentioned Thomas's name, not once. Halfway through the draft, Lucas entered without knocking. Nobody stopped him. He held his phone in trembling hands. Daniel, what happened? Lucas looked from Daniel to Margaret. Thomas is gone. The room became completely still. Daniel did not speak. Margaret lowered her eyes. When, 10 minutes ago, Evelyn called. Daniel stared at the unfinished article. His vision blurred, not from tears alone, from the realization that every possible decision had just changed. Thomas would never again speak publicly, never answer questions, never defend himself, never explain. The last person who could confess with his own voice was gone. Daniel quietly stood. I'm going back. Margaret nodded. Go. The hospice hallway was darker than before. Many doors were closed. Conversations had become whispers. Evelyn sat alone in the garden despite the cold rain. She looked up as Daniel approached. He suffered peacefully. Daniel sat beside her. I'm sorry. She smiled faintly. So was he. Daniel looked toward Thomas's window. Did he say anything? She nodded. Near the end, he asked whether you'd decided. Daniel closed his eyes. I hadn't, I know. She looked at the flowers. When I told him you were still thinking, he smiled. Daniel opened his eyes again. Why? Because he said uncertainty finally meant someone understood. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Rain slowly collected on the wooden bench. Evelyn finally reached into her coat. He asked me to give you this. A small brass key rested in her hand. Daniel recognized it immediately. The key Thomas had carried in the garden, Westbrook Apartments, maintenance room. Daniel carefully accepted it. There's one place you've never seen. Where? The room where everything began. Daniel looked at the worn key. Thomas wanted you to choose freely, only after he was gone. Daniel turned the key over in his hand. The metal had been polished smooth by years of carrying it. He never threw it away. No, Evelyn shook her head. He believed forgetting would have been another kind of escape. Daniel slipped the key into his pocket. A nurse quietly approached them. MS. Rhodes, there's something else. The nurse handed Evelyn a sealed envelope. Written across the front were 2 words, for Daniel. Evelyn looked surprised. I didn't know about this. Neither did the nurse. Daniel opened it carefully. Inside was a single handwritten page. Mr. Mercer, if you are reading this, I no longer have to wonder whether I chose correctly. Now that burden belongs to history. Not to me. Do not write to save my name. Do not write to protect my memory. Write only what helps the living carry tomorrow. Thank you for listening before deciding. Thomas Rhodes. Daniel folded the letter carefully. No confession. No instructions. No attempt to influence him. Only trust. As evening settled over the city, church bells rang somewhere beyond the hospice walls. Television helicopters still circled overhead. The country waited for answers. Daniel looked toward the quiet room where Thomas had taken his final breath. For 20 years, Thomas had carried the weight of one terrible night. Now, someone else carried the weight of deciding what the world would know, and there was no one left to ask if the decision was right. Daniel remained in the hospice until after sunset. No reporters were allowed inside. For a few hours, the building belonged only to grief. A small memorial service took place in the chapel. No cameras, no speeches prepared for the public, only a handful of people who had known Thomas as he had lived during his final years. Patients, nurses, volunteers, Arthur Collins. Daniel had not expected to see him. Arthur looked older than ever. The years seemed to have settled heavily onto his shoulders. He walked slowly toward Thomas's casket. No one interrupted him. He rested one hand on the polished wood. "You stubborn fool." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "You should have let me carry more of it." Daniel watched silently. Arthur remained there for nearly a minute before stepping away. When he turned, he noticed Daniel. "So, you finally know." Daniel nodded. "Yes." Arthur looked toward the casket. "I spent 20 years wishing he'd hate me. Instead, he kept thanking me." Daniel frowned. "For what?" "For surviving." Arthur laughed bitterly. "Imagine that." Daniel waited. Arthur took a slow breath. Every year he'd visit, every anniversary, he'd apologize. Every time, I'd tell him same thing: go help somebody. If apology changes nothing, then make tomorrow different. Daniel quietly asked, "Did it help?" Arthur thought for a long moment. "It didn't bring anybody back." Daniel nodded. Arthur continued. "But maybe." "It stopped another family from sitting where we are today." Daniel followed his gaze toward the casket. Neither man spoke again. After the service ended, people slowly left. No television cameras captured the quiet embraces. No headlines reported the names of the hospice volunteers who cried. Outside the gates, the media crowd had doubled. Reporters shouted questions toward every person leaving. Did Thomas Rhodes confess? Did he admit responsibility? Is it true he paid millions to buy silence? Daniel ignored every question. One microphone nearly touched his face. "Mr. Mercer, will your newspaper publish the documents?" He kept walking. Another reporter shouted, "Does the public deserve to know?" Daniel stopped. The crowd instantly fell silent. Every camera turned toward him. For a brief moment, he considered answering. Instead, he simply said, "The public deserves the truth, not speculation." Then he walked away. The sentence appeared online within minutes. Half the country praised him. The other half accused him of hiding information. Daniel read neither reaction. Late that night, he returned to his apartment. The first place he had truly been alone in weeks. He placed everything on his kitchen table. Thomas's confession, Michael's letter, the photographs, the brass key, Thomas's final note. 5 objects, 20 years. He sat without touching any of them. The apartment was silent except for rain against the windows. Eventually, he picked up the brass key. Tomorrow, he whispered the word to an empty room. Tomorrow, he would visit the maintenance room beneath Westbrook Apartments. The last place Thomas had protected from the world. His phone vibrated once. An unknown number. No message, only a photograph. It had clearly been taken that afternoon, Thomas's funeral. Daniel himself standing beside the grave. Someone had been watching. Written beneath the image were 7 words. "The last witness has finally gone home." Daniel stared at the screen. Thomas was dead. Michael was dead. Arthur had never seen the entire sequence. Only Evelyn and Daniel now possessed the complete truth. Whoever continued sending anonymous messages knew that, and they wanted Daniel to know it too. He looked once more at the brass key. Tomorrow would not simply answer the final questions about the fire. It would determine whether Thomas's final request survived him. Daniel switched off the light. The apartment fell into darkness. On the table, the brass key reflected a faint glow from the rain-soaked city outside. It was no longer evidence. It had become a responsibility. Daniel arrived at Westbrook Apartments just after sunrise. Most of the building had been renovated years earlier. Fresh brick covered old scars. New windows reflected gray morning clouds. Children waited for a school bus where firefighters had once carried survivors. The city had moved forward. The ground had not forgotten. The building manager was waiting. Evelyn called. She said you'd come. Daniel held up the brass key. The manager nodded. I wondered what happened to that thing. He led Daniel through narrow service corridors beneath the building. Concrete walls, old pipes, dust that had settled for decades. Finally, they stopped before a heavy steel door, the original maintenance room. The lock had never been replaced. Daniel inserted the brass key. It turned smoothly. The room smelled of rust and old wood. Most dangerous equipment had long been removed. Only forgotten shelves remained. Maintenance logs, electrical diagrams, inspection binders, everything preserved because nobody had bothered throwing it away. Daniel slowly walked inside. Nothing dramatic waited. No hidden confession. No secret recording. Just ordinary objects. The kind people never notice until after tragedy. He found an old wall clock. Its hands had stopped. 12:43. The approximate time investigators estimated the second explosion occurred. Time had ended there. For someone, it always would. He opened a maintenance binder. Repair requests filled the pages. Electrical faults, water damage, temporary wiring, repeated complaints, repeated delays, initials from supervisors, approval stamps, budget notes. Every page described another opportunity to prevent disaster. Daniel understood immediately. Thomas had been right. The fire never belonged to one person. It belonged to hundreds of small decisions. He photographed nothing, copied nothing, he simply read. When he finally stepped back outside, the rain had stopped. His phone buzzed. Margaret, have you found what you needed? Yes. Evidence, perspective. There was a pause. Come back. Daniel returned to the newsroom carrying only the brass key. He left every maintenance record exactly where it had remained for 20 years. In the conference room, Margaret looked at him. Well, Daniel placed the key on the table. There isn't another story. There never was. She smiled. Then write that. Daniel sat before the computer once again. This time he did not begin with Thomas, or Westbrook, or the fire. He began with himself. For 20 years, I believed journalism ended when every fact had been verified. I believed courage meant refusing to look away from uncomfortable truths. I still believe truth matters. I no longer believe truth belongs to those who shout it first. It belongs to those whose lives it changes. He paused, then continued. Every investigation asks who is responsible. Far fewer ask who must continue living after the headline disappears. During recent weeks, I uncovered a story involving tragedy, guilt, silence, sacrifice, redemption, and impossible choices. Every fact in that investigation has been verified. Some of those facts deserve public attention. Others belong to people who have already spent decades paying for them. Publishing everything I know would satisfy curiosity. It would not improve justice. It would not restore a single life. It would not protect another family. It would simply create new victims from old wounds. That is not why journalism exists. Lucas quietly stood behind him. You're really not naming him. Daniel kept typing. No, he continued. Journalists often speak about the public's right to know. That right is real. But rights also carry responsibilities. When information exposes ongoing danger, corruption, abuse, or crimes that continue harming innocent people, silence becomes complicity. When information exists only to reopen suffering that has already transformed into redemption, publication demands far greater humility. Margaret read each paragraph as it appeared. Daniel kept writing. Compassion must never erase truth. Truth must never abandon compassion. When either stands alone, justice becomes impossible. He stopped. The article was short, far shorter than anything expected. No exclusive evidence, no dramatic accusations, no names, no hidden photographs. Only one journalist admitting that certainty had limits. Lucas broke the silence. People are going to accuse us of protecting someone. Daniel nodded. Yes. Will they be wrong? Daniel looked out across the newsroom. Some will, some won't. That's the price of choosing principle over applause. Margaret took the article, read it one final time, made no edits. She walked toward the production desk. Editors looked confused. That's it? She nodded. That's today's front page. One editor hesitated. Where's the investigation? Margaret answered quietly. You're holding it. The presses began rolling. Sheets of paper rushed through the machines. Ink settled across thousands of pages. Daniel watched silently. No excitement, no victory, only relief. An hour later, the newspaper reached the streets. Readers expecting scandal instead found a personal editorial from the city's most respected investigative journalist. Television hosts read it aloud. Some praised it. Others mocked it. Political commentators accused Daniel of abandoning journalism. Ethicists called it one of the bravest editorials published in years. Social media fractured into endless arguments. Where is the name? Who is he protecting? Is this journalism or sentiment? Daniel ignored every reaction. He had not written for them. Late that afternoon, he returned alone to the hospice garden. Thomas's favorite bench remained empty. Rainwater still rested on the flowers. Daniel placed the brass key beside one white lily. He no longer needed to carry it. The lesson it opened had never been hidden inside the room. It had been hidden inside himself. As he turned to leave, his phone vibrated one final time. Another message from the anonymous number. No photograph, no warning, only 6 words. Now you understand why I waited. The number immediately disconnected. Daniel stared at the screen. For the first time, he chose not to wonder who had sent it. Some answers no longer mattered. Others already had. The response arrived faster than anyone expected. By evening, every major news network had quoted Daniel's article. Some called it an act of integrity. Others called it a betrayal of journalism. Editorial boards argued over whether a reporter had the right to withhold verified facts. Law professors debated public interest. Ethicists debated moral responsibility. Former judges debated justice. For 2 days, the country argued about a story that contained no names. Daniel watched very little of it. He spent most of his time answering one question inside himself. Did I do the right thing? No interview could answer it. No headline could either. On the 3rd morning, Margaret entered his office carrying a stack of letters. Real letters. Paper envelopes. People still write. She placed them on his desk. The first came from a firefighter. I have spent 30 years telling families the truth on the worst day of their lives. Thank you for reminding people that timing matters almost as much as honesty. The second came from the daughter of a man wrongly imprisoned decades earlier. I hated everyone who kept secrets from us. I never imagined I would someday thank someone for keeping one. The third contained only one sentence. Mercy without honesty destroyed my family. Thank you for refusing to lie. The fourth disagreed completely. You protected a criminal. Daniel read every letter. He placed none above the others. Every writer deserved to be heard. Lucas entered carrying his tablet. the rival newspaper published another editorial. Daniel looked up. "Do they have anything new?" "No, they're attacking you now." Daniel shrugged. That was inevitable. Lucas hesitated. "Do you regret it?" Daniel thought for a long moment. "I regret the fire. I regret the suffering. I regret every person who had to carry it." "The article?" "No." Lucas slowly nodded. "I think I finally understand." Daniel smiled faintly. "Good. Then one investigation accomplished something worthwhile." Later that afternoon, Evelyn asked Daniel to meet her at the cemetery. Thomas's grave remained simple. Only his name, his birth and death dates. Nothing about awards, nothing about success, nothing about redemption. Fresh flowers rested beside the stone. Someone had left a folded newspaper beneath them. Daniel recognized the front page immediately. His article. Evelyn noticed. "I didn't put it there." "Neither did I." They looked around. The cemetery was almost empty. An elderly woman stood several rows away beside another grave. She quietly approached them. "Mr. Mercer," Daniel nodded. She introduced herself. "My name is Emily Turner." Daniel's breath caught. "Michael's daughter." She smiled gently. "Dad used to say we'd meet one day." Evelyn looked surprised. "You knew?" Emily nodded. "Not everything, only enough. When I became an adult, Mom told me there was more to the story than the courts ever knew. She never told me names. Only that one man spent his whole life trying to become worthy of another chance." Daniel remained silent. Emily looked down at Thomas's grave. "I knew this had to be him." "How?" "Your article, you never named him, but you described him with kindness. Mom always said only one person deserved that." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Emily continued, "I don't want the rest." Daniel looked at her. "You're not curious?" "Of course I am." She smiled sadly. "Curiosity isn't always love. Mom taught me that." Daniel remembered Thomas's words, "Write only what helps the living carry tomorrow." Emily reached into her bag. She placed a small bouquet beside the headstone. "Tell him." She stopped and laughed quietly. "Old habits." "He's gone." She looked at the stone one last time. "I forgave him years ago. I just never knew his name." She walked away without asking another question. Daniel watched until she disappeared beyond the trees. Neither he nor Evelyn spoke. Nothing remained to explain. The truth had reached the person who needed it, not through headlines, not through exposure, not through public shame, through understanding. Daniel looked once more at the newspaper resting against Thomas's grave. The headline was small, almost plain. Its importance had never been in what it revealed, only in what it chose not to. He finally understood that silence and secrecy were not the same thing. One hides truth. The other sometimes protects where truth is meant to arrive. As he and Evelyn walked away from the cemetery, rain began falling again. Not enough to hide the city. Only enough to wash the dust from it. Behind them, the newspaper slowly became damp beneath the rain. The ink held, so did its message. The weight of honest words had never been measured by how loudly they were spoken, only by whose lives they changed. 3 weeks passed. Autumn settled deeper over the city. The news cycle had already moved on. Another scandal. Another election. Another public outrage. Daniel's article remained part of journalism schools, ethics panels, and editorial meetings, but television cameras had found newer stories to chase. The quiet that followed surprised him. For 20 years, Thomas had expected one confession to shake the world. Instead, the world barely paused. The people who mattered had never been the crowd. They had always been somewhere else. Daniel was sorting old notebooks when Evelyn called. "Would you come with me?" "Where?" "To see them." Daniel already knew who she meant. Michael Turner's family. He drove across the city to a modest brick house in an older neighborhood. The paint had faded. Flower boxes rested beneath the windows. Children's bicycles leaned against the porch. Life had continued there. Evelyn stood beside the front gate holding a weathered leather folder. Thomas's confession. Michael's letter. Photographs. Financial records documenting every anonymous scholarship, every donation, every payment Thomas had made over 2 decades. Everything. No omissions. No editing. Daniel looked at the folder. "Are you certain?" Evelyn nodded. "Thomas asked me to wait until after he was gone and after you made your decision. Today, the truth belongs to them." She knocked. Emily opened the door. She smiled gently when she recognized them. "I thought you might come. May we come in, of course." The house felt warm. Family photographs covered one wall. Michael appeared in almost every one. Smiling, holding Emily as a child, standing beside his wife, growing older, living the years Thomas believed he had stolen. Emily's mother entered from the kitchen. Her hair had turned almost completely gray. She looked at Evelyn for a long moment. "It's time." Evelyn nodded. Yes, they sat together around the dining table. No reporters, no microphones, no audience. Only the people whose lives had always belonged inside this story. Evelyn placed the folder on the table. "Everything is here." Emily looked toward her mother. Her mother simply nodded. "Read it." Emily opened Michael's letter first. She read silently, occasionally stopping, occasionally wiping tears from her face. Nobody interrupted. Then she read Thomas's confession, page after page. The room remained silent except for the turning of paper. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Hours passed. Daniel never spoke. This moment had never belonged to him. When Emily reached the final page, she carefully closed the folder. No one hurried her. Finally, she looked at her mother. "You knew all this?" Her mother nodded. "For many years." Emily asked the question Daniel had expected. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her mother looked toward the window. "Because I wanted you to grow up free." "Free to hate? No, free to become someone who could choose without carrying my anger first." Emily lowered her eyes. Her mother continued, "When your father died, I hated everyone. Thomas, the city, the courts, God, myself. If I had told you then, you would have inherited my rage before you were old enough to understand it." Emily reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "Thank you." Her mother began crying quietly, not because she had been forgiven, because she finally no longer had to carry the secret alone. Daniel watched without moving. He remembered the first day he received the anonymous envelope. Back then, he believed secrets existed only to protect guilt. Now he understood they could also protect healing. Emily opened the folder one final time. She removed the photograph of the 7 children standing outside the rebuilt community center. She smiled through tears. "He watched us grow up." Evelyn nodded. "Every year." Emily laughed softly. "Without ever asking us to thank him. No, he believed gratitude belonged to your father, not to him." Emily carefully placed the photograph back inside. "I don't know whether I would have forgiven him 20 years ago." Her mother answered quietly, "Neither would I." Emily looked at Daniel. "Your article helped." Daniel shook his head. "No, Thomas did, Michael did, your mother did, I only listened." Emily smiled. "Exactly." Silence settled over the room, not uncomfortable, peaceful. The kind of silence that follows understanding rather than uncertainty. As Daniel and Evelyn prepared to leave, Emily stopped them at the door. "There's one more thing." She walked to a bookshelf and returned carrying an old wooden box. "Dad left this for me. He said to open it only after I understood everything." She lifted the lid. Inside rested a small brass watch. Broken, its hands frozen forever at 12:43. Daniel immediately recognized the time. The second explosion. Beneath the watch lay a folded note in Michael's handwriting. Emily read it aloud. "If the day ever comes when you learn the whole story, remember this. Do not spend your life deciding who deserved forgiveness. Spend it becoming someone capable of giving it." Emily folded the note. Dad always knew. Her mother smiled through tears. He usually did. Outside, the rain had stopped. Clouds slowly opened. For the first time in weeks, sunlight reached the old street. Daniel and Evelyn walked toward the car without speaking. Halfway there, Daniel stopped. He looked back at the house. No reporters would ever know what had happened inside. No article would describe the tears. No television debate would discuss Michael's final note. The most important truth of the entire investigation would never become public. And for the first time in his life, that felt exactly right. Months later, Daniel stood before a university lecture hall filled with journalism students. A student raised her hand. "Professor Mercer, how do we know when not to publish something?" Daniel thought of Thomas, of Michael, of Evelyn, of Emily, of Margaret. Then he answered, "Every journalist learns how to ask whether something is true. The harder question is whether publishing it serves the people who must live with it. Facts answer the first question. Character answers the second." The room became silent. Another student asked, "Did you ever solve your biggest investigation?" Daniel smiled. "Yes." What was the answer? He looked through the classroom window as rain began falling outside. The answer was never a name. It was a responsibility. Class ended. The students quietly gathered their notebooks. One remained behind, a young reporter just beginning a career. She held a blank notebook in her hands. "Mr. Mercer, what's the first rule of investigative journalism?" Daniel looked at the empty pages. The same kind of notebook he had carried his entire career. He answered with quiet certainty, "Never forget that every fact belongs to someone's life before it belongs to your story." The young reporter wrote the sentence carefully. Daniel walked into the rain. He carried no investigations, no sealed envelopes, no impossible decisions, only the quiet understanding that truth had never been lighter. He had simply learned how to carry it.